"Turn around," he whispered. Her pulse leapt, swiveling in his arms. She stared at their reflection in the mirror. This is what she had wanted to see, the two of them locked, together, so different, but so good together. She leaned back into him, raised one arm to cup his head as he nuzzled the base of her neck. The arm around her waist, so strong and tan compared to her pale flesh, tightened, drew her hips into the cradle of his so she could feel his heavy arousal heat seared her as his other hand slid around to cup one breast, kneading, teasing, trapping her hardened nipple between thumb and forefinger, then rolling, pinching. She moaned, let her head fall back against his shoulder. "You like that?" he murmured. She nodded helplessly, sharp darts of pleasure piercing her. When he pulled back slightly, she moaned a protest and wavered. Where she stood, his arms left her. In the mirror, she saw him step back and shuck his jeans, tossing them aside. He wore nothing beneath them. Then he hooked his thumbs in the narrow waistband of her panties and tugged them down to her ankles, holding her steady. While she stepped out of them, moving up behind her once more, he clasped her shoulders, trailed his hands down to her fingers, and drew her arms out away from her sides. "Look at you," his heated gaze glowing. That bright otherworldly amber swept her form. "I've never seen anything more beautiful in my life. Touch me," she pleaded, every cell on fire. A wicked grin tilted his lips. "On your knees first," heart slamming against her ribs. She sank to her knees, kneeling behind her. He leaned forward to take her earlobe between his teeth, ever careful not to prick her with his fangs. "Spread your legs for me," she did so, watching his hand slide around from behind to recapture her breast. Wider breath shortening, she shifted until her knees were widely splayed. Roland pressed his hard-muscled, very aroused body against her back, brushing her hair aside. He pressed heated kisses to the sensitive skin beneath her ear. "Only you, Sarah." He slid his other hand around her waist and down, burying it in the dark thatch of curls at the juncture of her thighs. Sarah gasped, breath shortening as she watched his long tapered fingers part the tender folds of her body, warm and slick with welcome, and delve deep inside her, first one finger then two, while his thumbs circled and stroked her clit. "Only you make me burn like this." She couldn't respond, couldn't speak, as the pleasure spiraled through her, building as she rocked her hips helplessly against him. Roland groaned. She was so wet for him, so wild for him, her body clenching around his fingers as he stroked her and inflamed her, need his own building, until he couldn't wait any longer. He had to be inside her. She moaned a protest when he withdrew his fingers, then cried out when he guided his cock to her entrance and plunged into her hard from behind. The pleasure on her face was almost his undoing. His whole body trembled as he withdrew, then plunged again. She called his name, raised her arms, and reached back to grip his hair in her fists, drawing his head down. He slid his hand back into that tempting triangle of curls, stroking her in time to his thrusts. The scent of her was maddening, heightened by her arousal, making him crave more and more of her eyes. Heavy-lidded lips parted on gasping breaths. Sarah stared at their reflection in the mirror, watched his hands touch and tease and stroke her, pumping his hips. He thrust deeper and faster, the tension rising. She was close. They both were, the pleasure building until it was almost unbearable. "I love you, Sarah," he whispered hoarsely, his glowing gaze meeting hers in the mirror. Her body convulsed around him with the most powerful orgasm she had ever experienced. Crying out, she clung to him desperately, on the pleasure went as Roland continued to thrust. Just when she thought it would stop, Roland's body stiffened with his own climax. His fingers danced upon her swollen flesh, and a second orgasm claimed her. When the last ripples faded, they sank weakly to the floor. Sarah lay on her side. Roland spooned behind her and fought to regain her breath. He tightened his arms around her, held her close as though he feared his grasp was the only thing keeping her from slipping away. Looking over her shoulder, she pressed a kiss to his passion warm cheek. "I love you too." Chapter 15. The more immortal Sarah met, the more she understood Roland's inability to believe she might be of the gifted one's bloodline. Marcus arrived first, garbed in the black jeans, long-sleeved black t-shirt and boots. Both he and Roland favored the blades of the many knives and other wicked weapons that adorned him glinted in the overhead light. Chris arrived next in dark fatigues, similar to the ones David kept on hand for his guests there. was a holstered weapon under each arm and a thick file folder clutched in one hand. The lovely Lisette soon followed. Sarah had hoped female immortals might show a little more diversity in their appearance, but Lisette's long wavy hair was as black as Roland's, her eyes a lighter shade of brown. Sarah's heart sank. One would think that the coloring of the gifted ones would have been diluted at least a little bit after millennia of breeding. With ordinary humans, nothing drastica. Few hazel eyes mixed in a brown hair woven through the black here. Or there's something Roland had tried to tell her. No doubt he had wanted to spare her the crushing disappointment that now made her want to weep as Lisette greeted them with a smile. The only way the French woman differed from the men was in height and build. She was perhaps 5'2" feet tall, with a build similar to Sarah's, slender and athletic, yet shapely. Her long legs were encased in tight black jeans that rode low on her hips. A black tank top clung to full breasts and a small waist, over which she wore a long dark coat similar to the men's. Marcus smiled as he moved behind her and removed her coat. Lisette, the inner lining Sarah saw, contained a number of throwing knives and other blades she couldn't identify, neatly tucked into loops. Marcus, her voice was low, warm-colored, with a faint French accent, and as beautiful as she was, with her porcelain skin and perfectly proportioned features. Standing next to Roland, Sarah felt jealousy against her as the woman left Marcus and approached them. Lisette, Roland rumbled. Roland Moncuri. When she offered him her hand, Roland carried it to his lips for a kiss. I heard you had left your lair, but did not believe it. It was either leave it or burn with it. Even Lisette's laugh was pretty. Sarah found herself grinding her teeth. Roland may not have fallen in love with any woman before her, but he sure as hell hadn't been celibate. Had he sated his needs with human women or immortals like this one? Is this the woman who saved you? The French woman queried. Roland rested his large warm palm low on Sarah's back. Yes, Sarah, this is Lisette Dallasong. Lisette. Sarah Bingham, an honor to meet you. Sarah, she said with a smile, extending her hand. We are all in your debt. Sarah shook it and started to mention she hadn't done anything, but Lisette leaned in. He isn't really my heart, she said, with a smile indicating Roland. With a nod of her head. I only tease him because he's shy. Across the room, Marcus snorted. He isn't shy, he's antisocial. Roland cut him a glare. Lisette turned toward Chris. Chris, you handsome devil, what have you found for us? He grinned. You know, I hate to repeat myself, Sherry. I'll wait until everyone is here. Another immortal guardian entered, 6'1", short raven hair, deep brown eyes, with surprisingly thick lashes. This must be Lisette's brother. Black slacks clung to slim hips and powerful thighs as he removed his coat. A dark short-sleeved t-shirt showed off a muscular chest, broad shoulders, and bulging biceps. He, like the others including Roland, was armed to the teeth with numerous knives and a Glock. Etienne, Lisette said as he hung up his coat. Come and meet Roland's valiant mortal. I've decided we're going to be the best of friends. Sarah glanced up at Roland, who winked at her and gave her back a furtive caress. And came to stand beside his sister, bussing her on both cheeks. Then, smiling at Sarah, he extended his hand. You must be Sarah. It is a true pleasure to meet you. His voice was deep and tinged with a French accent as well. When Sarah placed her hand in his, he carried it to his lips for a kiss. As Roland had Lisette's nice to meet you too. The internet is all abuzz with tales of your heroics. What heroics? She asked, trying to discern if they were mocking her. Saving Roland's life, of course. It's all they're talking about on the Immortal Guardian website. They had a website. ATN released her and extended his hand to Roland with a smile. Good to see you, Roland. Roland shook his hand and nodded a greeting. It was strange seeing him like this, rather dour and tight-lipped. He was always so warm and open when the two of them were alone. Otten turned to Chris and Marcus next. Chris. He shook Chris's hand. Marcus. When Marcus shook his hand, Otten's face grew solemn. I was very sorry to hear about Lady Bethany. If there is any way I can be of service to you, my friend, anything I can do, please let me know. Marcus's lips tightened. I appreciate that. His eyes acquired the faintest glow, and Sarah was dismayed to see they reflected tremendous grief. Who was Lady Bethany? Was Marcus one of the immortals Roland had mentioned, who had loved a human? That she died recently? As Chris motioned for them to adjourn to the spacious dining room, Sarah made a mental note to ask Roland later. Lisette and Etienne took chairs beside each other at one end of a table long enough to seat 20. Roland guided Sarah to two chairs opposite them and sank down beside her, all business. He propped his elbows on the wood surface, splayed his knees and shifted slightly so his thigh would press against hers. "Has Lizette filled you in on all that's been happening with Roland and Bastian?" Chris asked Etienne as he seated himself in the chair at the end closest to them and dropped his file folder on the table. The Frenchman frowned. "She tells me you think he's an immortal." But Sarah gasped and jumped when Seth suddenly appeared beside the table. Everyone else reached for their weapons, then swore and relaxed. "Damn it," Marcus muttered, "give us some warning before you do that." Raising one eyebrow, the towering leader seated himself at the far end of the table and looked to Chris. "You've confirmed that Sebastian is an immortal, yes?" Everyone glanced uneasily at Seth, whose face was like granite. Even without knowing him, Sarah could tell Seth counted this as a personal failure. Everyone else knew it too and seemed to have no idea how to respond. It was a bit like watching children realize for the first time that their parents weren't infallible, as if they had never before known Seth to make a mistake. Michi chose that moment to slink into the room and, giving everyone else a wide berth, jump up into Seth's lap. Chris opened the file folder and thumbed through several pages. Sarah was right. Roland's enemy is definitely an immortal. He was born Sebastian Newcomb and became the Earl of Marston upon his father's death in 1807, after faking his own death in 1815. He was presumably killed by highwaymen, though of course his body was never found. He adopted the name Julian Marston Julian for his father Marston for the title. Since he didn't have our resources, he left a sporadic paper trail, moving every 20 or 30 years, sometimes varying his name. Though he always used family names, the network's European branches did a phenomenal job locating historic papers that bore his signatures, so we were able to map his movements fairly well. He passed each of them. Sarah included a sheaf of papers. Whatever made him want Roland's head on a platter happened in London. He continued looking at Roland, "because he's been dodging your footsteps ever since." Sarah stared at the papers before her. One half of the page, and all of those that followed, catalogued the many cities in which Roland had lived since his sojourn in London in the early 19th century in chronological order. The opposite side did the same for Sebastian, aka Julian Marston. Julian Newcomb, Sebastian Marston, and Marston Newcomb. Wherever Roland had gone, Sebastian had followed. It had sometimes taken him years to find Roland, but find him he would usually just in time for Roland to pack up and move again. "What the hell?" Roland muttered. "You lucked out when you moved to the States," Chris said, drawing their attention to the last few pages. "He lost you completely. And as you can see, spent the next several decades traveling the globe, I assume in search of you." Roland slammed the papers down. "I'm telling you, I have never seen this bastard before, not until the morning he staked me out for the sunrise." Marcus shook his head. "I don't remember seeing him before either." Etienne spoke up. "Well, he sure as hell saw Roland." He looked to Roland. "Maybe you killed the one who turned him. He's immortal, not vampire, so he may have been more loyal to the one who infected him." Roland waved to the pages in disbelief. To this extent, Seth cleared his throat. He had no one else. "It's plausible." An awkward silence fell. Chris shuffled his papers. "Anyway, Roland's self-imposed isolation worked to his advantage. Once you moved to the States, you forewent servants and refused to have a second. You very rarely interacted with the other Guardians, so he basically had no way to trace you. When he finally found you roughly 20 years ago, it was probably just dumb luck." Roland scowled. "So why not try to kill me? Then why wait?" "This is why." Withdrawing a multi-folded piece of paper, Chris spread it open on the table. "I traced him to an old farmhouse outside of Mebane. Julian Marston was the name on the lease, and took some satellite surveillance photos. Here's the first. It was the size of a road map and showed a large farmhouse and barns surrounded by a sizable clearing, then dense forest." Sarah's gaze swept over the others. "You have your own satellites." Chris shook his head. "Launching satellites into space would draw unwanted scrutiny. I just have friends in interesting places." "Oh, it's why he's the best cleaner," Marcus commented, then motioned to the map. "So this is his lair?" "Yes, this is where the unbelievable factor increases exponentially." Pulling out a second map, Chris unfolded it atop the other. Sarah and everyone else leaned forward with interest. "I wanted to find out how many, if any, vamp followers he had left, so I had my friend do a broader spectrum sweep with one of their keyhole satellites. The yellow figures are the humans, the violet ones are the vampires sleeping underground. Oh shit, what the hell? Sarah stared at the map. There were 4 yellow figures and dozens of violet ones. She looked at Roland. I thought vampires didn't travel in more than 2s or 3s. A muscle leaped in his jaw. They don't. Lizette's eyes were wide. There must be at least 50 of them. 57, Chris corrected. Etienne stood and spread his hands on the map. This extends well past the boundaries of the farmhouse. Chris nodded. According to the original blueprints, the house had a basement when he bought it, but he's clearly enlarged it. Marcus frowned. If he were above ground, it would feel the whole bloody clearing. Do you have a better layout of it? No, my team checked with every contractor employed in North Carolina and the surrounding states and got nothing. Bastian did the work himself. Roland tapped the map with his index finger, pointing out a red figure that was distanced from all the rest. Judging by the color, he was too cool to be human and too warm to be vampire. This is him. He sleeps away from the others. Marcus grunted. Probably doesn't trust them. They're fucking vampires. Do you think he knows? Luzette asked. Do you think he knows he's an immortal? Her brother shook his head and retook his seat. Vampires kill those they feed upon. No immortal could abide living with them, knowing innocent lives were being taken. Actually, Chris said, that's another thing. Out came more papers. My tech team hacked into his computer via the internet and found this. Sarah studied the papers handed to her. It was a list of names and addresses in various cities and towns throughout North Carolina, some in Virginia and South Carolina. We weren't sure what it was until we started looking up the people on the list and tracked Bastian's internet activity, or rather his human minions' activity. Most of it took place during the day. What is it? Roland asked, still frowning. A list of the vampire's victims. He keeps track of them. Sarah asked. No, he picks them. Everyone on that list is linked to kiddie porn, either as a buyer, a seller, or a producer, and has either recently gone missing or is dead. Sebastian is telling the vamps who to feed on and making sure the deaths don't appear to be vampire related. Etienne shook his head in disbelief. How the hell is he controlling them? Sarah cleared her throat. Doesn't the medical examiner or whoever examines the victims notice the lack of blood in the bodies? Sure, Marcus said, but vampire slaying isn't something that typically comes to mind when investigating apparent homicides, suicides, or accidents. Roland nodded. They usually assume the victims were killed and bled out in an unknown location before the bodies were dumped elsewhere. That sort of thing. Loisette stared at the map. It must have taken him the full 20 years to gather so many. They should all be mad by now unless he's turning them himself, Roland pointed out grimly. He could have infected them all only recently. Chris sat down once more. Or not all are digging turned up. Something else I found interesting. I can't be certain, but I'm pretty sure he's making them eat food. Everyone looked at him as if he were nuts except for Seth. Seth frowned and continued to stroke Naichi, who purred like a Harley Davidson. I sent my ops team out to survey the place this afternoon. Roland scowled. Then he knows we found him and could have already relocated. Chris shook his head. They were quiet and stayed out of sight. He never knew they were there. He's immortal. Have you forgotten our heightened sense of smell? We aren't amateurs, Roland. Chris bit out. They camouflaged their scent. How Sarah was with Roland. Immortals had noses like friggin' polar bears. She found it hard to believe Chris's men could have gone undetected. They bathed no scented soaps, shampoos, or deodorants, wore clothes washed in fragrance-free detergent, then hid whatever scent remained with cover scents and animal urine. Sarah wrinkled her nose in disgust and saw Lizette do the same. Animal urine, Marcus parodied. Sure, hunters do it all the time. Trust me, no one knew they were there. Gross. What did they see? Marcus asked. A truck delivering a big-ass load of groceries, mostly fresh vegetables and fruits. My hackers went to work again and found out Julian Marston has a standing order with the supplier. Every 2 days enough food to feed an army is delivered according to his payroll. You've cut the number of humans serving Sebastian from 13 to 4, but the deliveries keep coming, and even if you hadn't, it would be too much for the humans to consume so quickly. Clearly the food isn't solely for them. But vampires didn't eat food, Roland had told her. The bloodlust struck them so fast and hardly lost interest in any other form of sustenance. "He's trying to save them," Lysette declared sadly. "Will that work?" Sarah asked the table at large. "Will eating food keep them sane?" All eyes went to Seth. "No, we tried that several times. Those who were already mad only consumed food when forced to through starvation, and it made no difference. Neither did denying them blood straight from the vein, and instead feeding it to them in a glass or bag. Once the madness claims them, they're lost." "And the newbies?" Chris asked. Seth shook his head. "If we caught them within weeks of being turned, feeding them food didn't prevent the madness from striking. It merely slowed the descent. If they were fortunate, they could have for possibly 5 years. But they were painful ones. The unceasing battle for sanity was exhausting. They had to be watched constantly, and if they slipped and tried to harm a human, they were tortured by memories of it during their lucid moments. They cannot be saved." A somber silence felt ultimately broken by Chris. "So what's the plan?" Sarah couldn't see any remotely palatable way to end this. Roland's hand tightened around hers an instant before he spoke in a cold, determined voice. "We extract Sebastian, then raise the compound." The faces of Roland's immortal brethren were grim in the aftermath of his proclamation. He didn't look at Sarah, afraid of the condemnation he might see in her beloved face. What a cold-blooded bastard she must think him. As the other immortal guardians exchanged troubled looks, Roland braced himself for the moment she would withdraw her hand. Etienne cleared his throat. "Am I the only one suffering qualms about killing vampires who have never harmed an innocent?" Marcus sighed heavily. "No." "How do you know they haven't?" Sarah queried, drawing Roland's surprised gaze. She was still holding his hand. Chris held up the list of pedophiles. "Trust me, Sarah, no one on this list is innocent." "Yes, but you're assuming they haven't killed anyone." "Not on the list." "Is there some rule that prevents vampires from killing more than one person per night?" 57 is a large number to keep track of. Couldn't some of them have strayed without Bastion knowing it? Roland had had the same thought. If they were careful not to get any blood on them, so he couldn't discern to different sense. "Yes, we don't know for sure that he would even object," Lysette said slowly. "He has lived with vampires for 2 centuries. I know it is unpleasant, but we must consider the possibility that in some ways he may have come to think like them. He certainly shares their hatred of immortals." Marcus said. A high-pitched ring pierced the air. Chris pulled a cell phone from his pocket and gave it a glance. "Excuse me, I have to take this." Rising, he held the phone to his ear and strode into the living room. "Yes, Sebastian's approval or disapproval makes little difference in terms of our goal here." Seth spoke. "I want him taken alive and handed over to me. The others are to be destroyed. If we let them live and do nothing until they lose their tenuous hold on sanity and kill hundreds of innocents could fall victim before we manage to hunt them all down, that is unacceptable." Everyone murmured their agreement. When Chris returned, Roland was debating strategy with the others, while he drew soft circles on the back of Sarah's hand with his thumb. "Well, Sarah was right again," Chris announced, reclaiming his seat, and he got his hands on several of the police reports filed for the dead pedophiles and kiddie porn peddlers. "And Bastion's vamps are unquestionably cheating on their diet." He tapped the list of victims. "Several of these freaks were married, and the vamps sent to feed on them killed the wives and children for dessert." "Shit, how the hell have we not heard about this?" "None of the victims lived in the Triangle, or the Triad." The Triangle was made up of the neighboring cities of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. The Triad consisted of Greensboro, High Point, and Winston-Salem, and they were spread out and camouflaged in enough different ways that no correlations have been drawn between the deaths. Sarah looked to Roland. "I wish I had been wrong," giving her hand a supportive squeeze. He returned his attention to planning their attack. The hallway outside the mystery woman's bedroom was empty when Seth appeared in it. The sheaf of papers Chris had given him clasped in one hand. A quick look inside showed him the room too was devoid of her presence. No big surprise there. The poor girl still wasn't sleeping, worried about her continued insomnia. He had reached out very subtly with his gifts and determined that it was no longer that she was unwilling to sleep. She couldn't sleep, not until she felt safe. It seemed to be some sort of subconscious defense mechanism she was helpless to extinguish. He, David, and Darnell had all trodden carefully around her and made themselves appear as harmless as possible. He didn't know what else he could do to reassure her. Of course, she was a tiny thing, barely reaching 5 feet. It was a little hard to look harmless when one was at least 1.5 feet taller than her and outweighed her by a good 120 pounds. Seth strode down the hallway and began making his way downstairs. The only sounds of life came from the great hall, which except for the stone walls now resembled a modern living room. Following them, he saw David standing in the shadows outside the entrance and started to call out a greeting. David glanced up and placed a finger to his lips. Seth instantly altered his approach, silencing his footsteps. As he joined him and peered into the room, Darnell was perched on the edge of the sofa, fingers and thumbs working a PlayStation controller on the large-screen television. Tomb Raiders. Lara Croft took a running leap from a ledge and grabbed the end of a rope that dangled over a dark, cavernous room. The mystery woman stood beside the sofa, out of arm's reach, as she always did, eyes glued to the screen. "See," Darnell said with a boyish grin, "I told you she'd make it." Seth was shocked to see her eyes light up with what would have been a smile if her lips had moved. "Now I'll make her swing." Jump to the next rope, swing again, and land on that ledge over there. Looking doubtful, she returned her attention to the screen and leaned against the arm of a recliner arranged perpendicularly to the sofa. The pale blue V-neck t-shirt she wore clung to small breasts and left bare her prominent collarbones and arms that weren't as skeletal now that she was eating. Regularly black and blue pajama bottoms hung on bony hips that had finally gained a bit of flesh on them. Her small feet were bare. She was still far too thin and looked so fragile it broke Seth's heart and David's and Darnell's. Her face was less gaunt and had more color. It was a pretty face with full lips, a pert nose, and winged brows. Dark shadows still lingered beneath her eyes, however, a testament to her fatigue, bearing in mind the fact that this was her 8th day without sleep. She looked fantastic. Seth had once read about a sleep study a university had conducted to see how long a person could go without sleep. The longest any of the participants had lasted was 11 days. By only the 4th participant's thought processes and motor skills had become sluggish. Problems with short-term memory had arisen. They had had difficulty concentrating, become delusional, and been extremely moody, symptoms that had steadily increased in severity as the days progressed. Not so their mystery woman. The only evidence of her lack of sleep lay in the bruising under her green eyes. Beneath Seth's scrutiny, those eyes widened as Lara Croft swung from one rope to another and grabbed it. Darnell sent her another grin of triumph. Seth's breath caught when she smiled back. Darnell went very still for a second, but to his credit continued as though nothing special had taken place. "Once Lara gets over to the ledge, keep an eye out for med pack. She's running low, and there should be one hidden around there somewhere." Damned if their guest didn't move to sit on the very edge of the chair's cushion and lean forward to watch Lara Croft's progress more closely. Seth looked at David and raised his brows. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, too softly for human ears to catch. "The whole time you've been gone," he responded, equally quiet. "Darnell needed to take a break from trying to decrypt those files we snatched." Music indicating a discovery trilled from the television. "Cool, more flares and a grenade launcher." Seth winced. Couldn't he have picked a less violent game? David shrugged. He was already playing it when she came down to watch him. Has Lara shot or been attacked by anything yet? "Just some bats, and it didn't seem to alarm our girl." "Good. I'm not sure how much of her rescue she remembers and worry she might not react well to violence. Even if it is only a game, there was a hell of a lot of gunfire that night." David smiled wryly. "I've never been shot so many times in one night, or by such high-caliber weapons. Damn thing stung." He nodded to the papers in Seth's hand. "Speaking of bloodbaths, what happened at the meeting?" Seth sighed, feeling infinitely weary. "Sebastian has done the impossible. Excluding the 23, Roland and Marcus have already managed to destroy. Sebastian has 57 vampires living beneath his roof." David's eyes widened. "What, he's trying to save them?" he said, feeling the same sadness Lisette had demonstrated when she had made the declaration earlier, making them eat food, assigning them pedophiles to feed upon instead of innocents. "But most are already straying from the path he's chosen for them. Did he turn them all himself?" "I don't know." The mystery woman suddenly leapt up and hurried over to the television to point at something on the large screen. "What is it?" Darnell asked, making Lavra backtrack a few paces. Oh, a crevice. I didn't even see that. Lara jumped up, grabbed the edge, and crawled in. All right, a medipack, thanks. Smiling, she returned to her seat. How about that? David murmured with a smile of his own. I should have known. If anyone could make her smile, it would be Darnell. Darnell was the least intimidating of the three of them, 6 feet tall, with a lean build, medium brown skin, and a shaven head. He was 26 years old, and had a naturally cheerful disposition. Few could resist now, if only he could entice her to speak. Seth thought. David sobered. So let's hear it. Tell me what you've learned that everyone else doesn't know. Discerning bastard, Seth grumbled. No more so than you. Spill it. Seth hesitated. There was something the others hadn't caught, something he feared would have made them refuse to take Sebastian alive if they had known it. Sebastian has a grudge against Roland. I don't know the source of it, but he's been trying to catch up with him for 200 years, tracking and following him to every city he's inhabited. Roland doesn't know why. No. Seth held up the papers. Rawdon listed many of the country's cities and towns Sebastian has visited, along with dates, and he was loath to say it. He was in Scotland the year Ewan was killed. David swore the Scottish immortal had been a favorite and had been mourned by them all. There were so few vampires in his region, and none were banding together. Seth continued. We always wondered how one could have killed a guardian of you and strength. It never occurred to us that it could have been another immortal. The others can't know. Seth agreed. Even if it was in self-defense, they would want his head, and Seth was now burdened with the knowledge that his own failure had caused it all. David's gaze turned piercing, seeing far more than Seth wanted him to. You must stop blaming yourself. It's my fault. No, it isn't, he insisted. You can't be everywhere at once. You can't be everything to everyone. If I had been there to help him, Sebastian wouldn't have suffered. He wouldn't have begun hating immortals and harboring vampires, and Ewan would still be alive. There is no proof he killed Ewan, only speculation. He has tried to kill Roland 3 times thus far, and probably would have killed Marcus and Sarah if he felt it necessary. David may not blame Seth for this, but the others did. They had not verbalized it or acknowledged it consciously, but their silence had said it all. Seth had screwed up. He always aided the new immortals after their transformations, and because he hadn't aided Sebastian, did they object to your intention to rehabilitate him? David asked, abandoning his attempts to ease Seth's guilt. No. When are you going in? Tomorrow. Are you sure you want me to remain here? 5 against 57 could get a little hairy. I'm sure I want our guests safe at all times, and know that with you here she will be as one. They turned to look at the mystery woman, and were surprised to find her staring back as though she had heard every word. Who was Lady Bethany? Sarah and Roland lay together in their bedroom as dawn broke, only a dim nightlight warding off complete darkness. Both were anxious about the coming battle and found sleep elusive. To take her mind off the danger Roland would soon face, Sarah had decided to ask about the woman Etienne had mentioned lying on his back staring up at the ceiling. Roland stroked and toyed with her hair as she snuggled closer. Lady Bethany, Countess of Westcott, also known as Bethany Bennett. Was she Marcus's wife? No, but she was the only woman he has ever loved, and he loved her for a very long time. Sarah recalled the grief that had flared in Marcus's eyes when Etienne had offered his condolences. Did she die? It's a little more complicated than that. Well, that was cryptic. Shifting, she folded her hands on his chest and propped her chin on them. Will you tell me? Smiling down at her, he drew the backs of his fingers across her cheek. I don't know that you would believe me if I did. It's a very strange story. She smiled. Stranger than vampires and immortals believe it or not. Yes, it's why every immortal knows about it. Even the minstrels of my time could not have concocted such a sad tale. Now you have to tell me. He nodded his assent, but said no more. Well, she prompted, poking him in the side. He jumped and laughed when she hit a ticklish spot, then promptly grabbed her fingers so she wouldn't do it again. I'm just trying to decide where to start, the beginning or the end. The beginning, she decided for him. As you wish. He lifted his head and brushed her lips with a kiss, then relaxed back against the pillow. Have you ever seen those stories on television in which a dog that has been horribly abused is taken in by someone who treats it well and loves it, and as a result becomes fiercely loyal to its new owner, so much so that it would die defending or protecting him. Sarah studied him curiously. Yes, well, that's pretty much what happened to Marcus. He was born Bryce, heir to the Earl of Duningford in the late 12th century. His father died when he was a boy and his mother was pressured into remarrying quickly. His stepfather turned out to be a sadistic bastard who beat Marcus and his mother every chance he could get. After he discovered Marcus's gift, he abused him even more. This went on for years, and he eventually killed Marcus's mother, claiming she fell down the stairs. Dismayed, Sarah felt her heart grow heavy as Roland continued. He would have killed Marcus too if Marcus hadn't fled. Sought out Lord Robert, Earl of Fosterley, a man he knew his stepfather feared, and become his squire. Lord Robert was a good man and treated Marcus like a younger brother, giving him the friendship and affection he had been missing. So naturally, Marcus loved him like a father or the older brother. He had never had respected him above all others and would have gladly given his life to protect him. Then one day, when Marcus was around 17, he had been with Robert 3 or 4 years. I think at that point Robert brought home a woman unlike Marcus had ever encountered, Lady Bethany. Yes, Robert and 3 of his men had found her in the forest covered in blood and searching frantically for her brother. He told Marcus the two had been attacked by an enemy he was dealing with at the time, but Marcus found out later she was actually from the future. Sarah stared at him, doubting that she had heard him correctly. I'm sorry, what Lady Bethany was in reality Bethany Bennett, born in Houston, Texas near the end of the 20th century, around the time you were. Now that I think on it, you're kidding, right? No. Sarah sat up abruptly, the covers falling to her waist. No way. His eyes darkened as they fell to her breasts. I warned you. It was hard to believe. How did she go back in time? His hands went to her waist. If I promise to explain it all later, will you let me finish my tale? Oh, I can make love to you again. Her pulse leapt beneath his faintly glowing gaze. Her nipples tightened. Deal long story short, Bethany and Robert fell madly in love, married, and lived happily ever after. Her jaw dropped. What about Marcus? Marcus fell in love with her, adored her as much as Robert did, but never told either one of them he loved both of them too much to threaten the happiness they had found together. And as I said, he was fiercely loyal to Robert. He would never have betrayed him by pursuing the woman Robert loved. Sarah stared at him in consternation. Geez, that's fucked up. I know. What's worse is Marcus never stopped loving her after she died, a very old woman. He spent the next 8 centuries alternately mourning her and looking forward to seeing her again. When the 20th century finally rolled around, Roland shook his head. He was like a child waiting for Santa Claus to arrive. Bethany was born, and Marcus moved to Houston to watch over her while she grew up. He bought the house next door to her when she was 16 or 17, befriended her, Josh, and their father helped her through her father's death a year later, became one of her and Josh's closest friends, and treasured every moment he spent with her until she went back in time to Robert when she was 22. Sarah bit her lip. He never dated her, or Roland shook his head. As far as he was concerned, she was Robert's wife. Marcus's relationship with her was always platonic, even in the future or present, when it could have been more. Sarah didn't know what to say. He never found anyone else. No, some immortals thought he was crazy to pine after her for so many years, then refrain from sleeping with her when he knew her again. But the rest of us are a little awed by it. I suppose his love for her never diminished in all those years, and when he met her again and could have seduced her, he chose the honorable path and didn't, because his loyalty to Robert never diminished either. Wow. He could have even tried to keep her from going back in time. Roland shook his head. He knew she would be happier with Robert, that they were meant to be together. And she's gone now. Is that why? ATN offered condolences. Yes, Bethany went back to the Middle Ages 7 years ago. So Marcus will never see her again. Sarah laid back down. No wonder he looks so somber whenever he isn't ragging on you. He still grieves. Rolling onto his side, Roland slid down until his face was even with hers on the pillow. I admit that I was one of those who thought him foolish for not pursuing her. When they met again, he touched her face gently, drawing his fingers down her temple and over her cheek. Sarah's heart clenched. He was looking at her as though beholding something precious. But I understand now, he loved her enough to place her happiness above his own. He brushed his lips against hers in a tender kiss. It's how I feel about you, Sarah. I want you to be happy. It's why I've tried not to pressure you into staying with me after we apprehend Bastion. Sarah bit her lip. She had noticed that he hadn't once asked her to stay with him. I thought maybe you were feeling ambivalent about it. Ambivalent? He pressed his forehead to hers. I love you. I would spend eternity with you if I could, but barring that I would settle for every remaining minute of your mortal life. Then pray you'll be reincarnated, so that I may find you again. I want to have my blood tested. She knew now she would leap at the chance to spend eternity with him, and could not yet bring herself to abandon that hope. He stared at her, his gaze penetrating. And if it confirms you're human, your scientists are working on a way to mutate the virus in vampires and turn them immortal. Maybe they'll find something before I get too old. If you were old when you were transformed, the virus would reverse the damage aging had done to your body, and you would become young again. Cool. But those scientists have been trying to turn vampires into immortals since before the arrival of modern science. Sarah, the outlook is pretty bleak. He seemed determined to burst her bubble. Then I'll spend the rest of my life loving you and laughing with you, and will do my damnedest not to let it get to me when you stay hot and I wrinkle like a prune. Roland wrapped his arms around her and hugged her so tight Sarah could barely breathe. I promise I'll try to be less antisocial in the future. Sarah hugged him back, throat tightening. And I promise I'll try not to refer to you as my boy toy when I look old enough to be your grandmother. Chuckling, he rolled her to her back. Shall I also promise to give you at least one orgasm every day for the rest of your life? Sarah smiled as he settled his large warm body between her thighs, his erection teasing her center. Only if you start right now. He dipped his head, lips slanting over hers, tongue dipping inside to send fire burning through her. She was breathless when he drew back slightly, eyes glowing, and gave her a wicked grin. It would be my pleasure. In the next instant, he glided down her body, kissing, licking, and nipping until he reached her core. Sarah threw back her head and sank her fingers into his hair. Oh yes. Chapter 16. Roland fastened the Velcro tabs on his bulletproof vest, then donned a shoulder holster that housed a SIG P2 26 9mm. The many pockets of his black cargo pants he filled with extra clips and numerous throwing stars. His favorite psi were slid into sheaths attached to each thigh, pulling a leather strap over his head. He settled it on one shoulder so it draped across his chest like an ammunition belt, then filled the small slits in it with a dozen throwing knives. His thoughts were chaotic. The cold deliberation that usually overtook him before a fight had completely deserted him. Bending, he slipped more knives into his boots. He could feel Sarah watching him and knew without looking up that she was sitting on the foot of the bed, worrying her lower lip as she had been the entire time. He had been gearing up. Once he had packed on as many weapons as he could without hampering his mobility. He straightened and glanced over at her. Come here, love. Rising, she moved to stand before him. Roland picked up the smaller Kevlar vest he had found and began strapping her into it. A shoulder holster with a Glock 9mm followed. Have you changed your mind? She asked hopefully. Am I coming with you? Hell no. He didn't want her anywhere near that place. You've been training me all week, Roland, and I'm an excellent shot. We've already discussed this several times. She rolled her eyes, looking vaguely disgruntled. We didn't discuss it. I suggested I may be of some help to you and you gave me the finger. I did not give you the finger. You may as well have. You shot me down so quickly I didn't even have a chance to list all the pros. He started filling her pockets back and front with extra clips and throwing knives. I don't care if you have 100 pros. They won't outweigh the con, which is you getting killed. He snapped, patience fraying. Damn it, Sarah. You are not going with us, so would you just drop it? He saw her frown as he adjusted her holster and told himself to get a fucking grip. What the hell was wrong with him? Why was he shouting at her? She was just trying to help. If I'm not going with you, she broached softly, then why are you arming me to the teeth? I want to make certain you're as safe as possible while I'm gone. He knew the fight was going to go down at Bastion's lair, but still felt riddled with anxiety at the thought of leaving her. She was so small, so fragile, so very mortal. Chris's men arrived an hour ago, she pointed out, and are positioned every 2 yards around the exterior of the house. A dozen more are patrolling the grounds. And there are 3 stationed at the gate. He scowled. I don't know or trust any of those men. She pursed her lips. Well, Chris should arrive at any minute and is going to stay inside and guard me himself. Until you return, you trust Chris, don't you? Not entirely. He examined her black-clad form judiciously. She needed more pockets when he reached out to adjust her shoulder holster a 3rd time. She captured his hands in her own and held them still. Roland, look at me, she commanded quietly. He met her hazel gaze. What is it? She asked, studying him carefully. You aren't usually this antagonistic or abrupt, at least not with me, so talk to me. Is it Bastian? Are you worried something might go wrong tonight? No, it isn't that. He gripped her hands tightly, memorized each cherished feature. It's just different this time, and I'm not handling it very well. I'm sorry. Her expression lightened a bit. That's okay. How is it different? He forced a smile, though he knew it was a lame attempt. I've never had anything to lose before. I think it's making me nervous. Her mouth formed a silent O. Then she threw her arms around him and held him tight. Careful, he enjoined, gingerly hugging her back. He had a lot of blades with razor-sharp edges lashed to him. She shook her head and whispered in a choked voice, I love you. He rested his cheek on her hair, inhaling her alluring scent. I love you too. Nothing is going to happen to me. But so much already had. I can't stop worrying. He always seems to find us. Not this time. You're striking during daylight hours. He'll be in Seth's custody, and you'll be back here by sunset. He nodded, though he lacked her confidence. Bastian was a wily adversary who had proven to be tremendously unpredictable. You can't let anything happen to you either. Roland, come back to me safely. I will. Leaning back, he lowered his lips to hers for a gentle kiss. If Bastian's human minions show up, hell, at any sign of trouble, head for the tunnels. Chris had finally disclosed the locations of the secret escape routes he had mentioned over the phone. Inside the armoire, every subterranean bedroom possessed a false back that concealed the entrance of a tunnel that led deep into the surrounding forest. Each tunnel had its own hidden exit that allowed those who followed it to surface in complete shade, even in winter, a safe enough distance from the house that they would be neither seen nor heard by anyone besieging it. After examining them all, Roland had decided he would add the same to his next home. Whenever he built or bought it, had he had such in his last home, he, Marcus, and Sarah could have escaped the fire without venturing into the sun, and Sarah would have never been exposed to the minions' gunfire. He had grown too complacent in recent years. Thank you for making sure they're free of creepy crawlies, Sarah said, drawing a smile from him. Anything for you. He knew her fear of bugs embarrassed her, but he sure as hell didn't think less of her because of it. She was willing to go up against insane vampires and men with guns who gave a rat's ass about a little insect phobia. At that moment, the doorbell pealed, a courtesy, since all the Immortals in the area had keys and knew the alarm codes. A second later, they heard the front door open. Sarah sighed. That must be Chris. He nodded. Marcus, Luzette, and Etienne are with him. Time to go. Linking his fingers through hers, Roland drew her with him down the hallway, up the stairs, and into the living room. Once there, they both stopped and stared. Chris was decked out in black fatigues and a Kevlar vest, an automatic weapon under his right arm, a .45 semi-automatic holstered on his right thigh. Fastened to his left thigh was a wicked-looking tactical knife. Marcus was dressed and armed much as Roland was. Lizette and Etienne, however, were both clad in what appeared to be dull black rubber pants and long-sleeved shirts that fit them like a second skin. The pants were tucked into heavy boots. The neckline of the shirts rose all the way to their chins, their hands concealed by gloves made of the same peculiar material, clutched matching masks and wraparound sunglasses. Two red Shoto swords were strapped to Lizette's back, and a pair of Glock 18s equipped with extended 31-round magazines were strapped to the outside of each slender thigh. Etienne had armed himself with a couple of sheathed short swords and numerous throwing knives that hung in a belt across his chest like Roland's. When Roland and Sarah continued to stare at their odd suits, Etienne spread his arms wide and raised his eyebrows. They offer us complete protection from the sun. Interesting. Roland hadn't heard anything about this. Even on the internet message boards, I wondered how you two would manage to survive the daylight. The younger the Immortals, the more sensitive they were to sunlight. And these two were only a couple hundred years old. Are they comfortable? Not really, Lizette answered. Her long black tresses were slicked back into a neat braid that disappeared into the neckline of her shirt. ATN grimace. They chafe like a mother when you sweat, Marcus grinned, which is why I'm not wearing them. Chris motioned to Roland's clothes. Don't worry, you're protected to all the clothing David provides. Offers 98% protection against UVA and UVB rays as old as you are. That should be enough. I did bring a couple of extra masks, sunglasses, and gloves though, in case you were interested. Roland and Marcus each took a mask, a pair of gloves, and sunglasses. Slipping his hand inside the rubbery ski mask, Roland held it up for Sarah to see. She reached out and felt it wrinkling her nose at the automobile tire texture, then shrugged. As long as it protects your pretty face, I'm all for it. Grinning, he turned back to the others. They were all staring at him with wide eyes. He scowled what they blinked. Nothing, Chris mumbled, pulling an iPhone from one of his pockets. He handed it to Marcus. Since you're a little more computer and electronic savvy than the others, you get to hang on to this. One of my contacts is going to download another real-time keyhole satellite surveillance photo at precisely 5 o'clock. They will confirm how many humans and vamps are inside. And since we don't know the layout of that massive basement, will hopefully serve as a guide and help you navigate it and find them all. You'll only get the one photo because he isn't supposed to be doing this shit and is risking his ass to help us. Seth abruptly appeared behind Chris. Sarah jumped and emitted a startled squeak, then sighed as she met Roland's amused gaze. I don't think I'm going to get used to that anytime soon, he smiled. It's been 9 centuries, and I'm still not used to it. Chris stepped aside so Seth could join the circle. I've already briefed them. Excellent, let's book. Roland turned to Sarah as the others filed toward the door. Her sweet face was pinched with worry as she rose onto her toes and wrapped her arms around him. Be careful, he kissed her. I will. Then he kissed her again. Remember, at the first sign of trouble, head for the tunnels. Will. He kissed her one more time, deeply drinking in her taste and her scent, then reluctantly set her away from him. Donning the rubbery mask, gloves, and sunglasses, he followed the others through the front door and out into the late afternoon sunlight. Sarah's stomach churned as she nervously paced the perimeter of the living room. Low music and voices changed mid-sentence as Chris Channel surfed from his position on one of the cushy sofas. Every once in a while she would feel his gaze stray to her, observe her for several seconds, then return to the television. All the curtains had been pulled back. Golden sunlight poured in through the western windows and spilled across the plush cream-colored carpet. Sparkling dust motes spun and danced as she passed through them. Curled in an overstuffed chair in one corner, Naichi raised his head and peered sleepily at her as she neared him. Sarah paused to rub his fuzzy head and stroke his chin before continuing on. It was impossible to remain still when worry was twisting her insides into knots. How long have they been gone? She asked for the second time. Chris checked his watch. 7.5 minutes, she groaned. That's all. She would have sworn at least half an hour had passed. How much longer until they get there? Do you think? Depending on traffic, about 15 minutes. Why didn't Seth just pop them over there? You mean teleport them? She nodded. He can only teleport to places he's already been, unless you're talking to him on the phone. Then he can find you by following the cell signal or zoning in on your brain waves. I can never decide which and keep forgetting to ask. Sarah almost smiled. How can you be so relaxed about all of this? He didn't look at all concerned. I've been at this long enough to have seen them in action and know that they're extremely good at what they do, and I'm not in love with any of them. Glancing through one of the northern windows as she passed, she saw the back of one of Chris's heavily armed men. Is it that obvious? As obvious as his love for you is. Another window, another guard. I'm going to have my blood tested to see if I can be transformed. She wasn't sure why she told him, perhaps to test his reaction, since according to Roland, no gifted one had ever willingly been transformed. Nietzsche rolled over onto his back and struck a cute pose as she approached again, offering his tummy up for a rub. Sarah obediently stroked his soft fur, smiling faintly when he rumbled with purrs of satisfaction. Once he had gotten used to her being around, Naichi had begun to come to her for treats and caresses almost as often as he did to Roland. When Chris failed to reply to her announcement, she glanced up and found him turned around on the sofa watching her over its back, his expression inscrutable. "You think there's no chance, don't you?" Giving the cat a last stroke, she recommenced circumnavigating the big room. "Roland does too. It isn't impossible," he said, slowly swiveling around as he followed her progress. "Just improbable." And she had thought the day couldn't get any grimer. "Roland told me gifted ones always have black hair and brown eyes, no matter their race. I have neither. Actually, there's a gifted one in DC who has brown hair." Stopping short, Sarah stared at him. "What?" Chris nodded. "She came to my attention about 6 years ago when her college roommate was murdered in their dorm room. She's a gifted one." "You sure?" "I'm sure." It caused quite a stir when the police ran her DNA. I had to call Sethan to wipe a hell of a lot of memories and explain things to her. And she had brown hair." Her heart began to thud in her chest. "Just a bit darker than yours. Why doesn't Roland know about this?" "He would have told her if he did." Chris rolled his eyes. "Roland avoids all of us like the plague. And this didn't make it onto the Immortal Guardian's website. Not very many people know," which would explain why Marcus hadn't said anything either when he had realized Roland was falling for her. "Does the woman have any special gifts?" He nodded. "She has minor psychic abilities, knows someone is going to call before the phone rings, or that she's going to receive a package before the postman arrives. That sort of thing. Not enough to enable her to pick the lotto numbers, but enough for her to notice." And there came reality crashing back down again. She sighed. "My eyes aren't brown, and I have no gifts." His look turned sympathetic. "Hazel is close to brown, and maybe you simply have a gift that's mild enough you haven't noticed it yet. It was nice of him to try." "Thanks, Chris." But she broke off, her gaze drawn beyond him to the corner as Naichi suddenly flipped onto all fours and looked toward the hallway. Sarah followed his gaze and saw nothing. The hallway was empty, the doorways leading to the library, bedrooms, and basement all open and equally bereft. "What is it?" Chris asked, sitting up straighter. "Nothing, I think." Michi dropped into a crouch belly, practically touching the cushion, ears laid back, and hissed. An icy tingle of fear swept down Sarah's spine. "What the hell?" A blur of motion burst from the hallway and rocketed toward the sofa. Blood sprayed from Chris's mouth and nose as his head slammed back. Then he fell sideways, unconscious, onto the cushions as the blurry form looming over him stilled it, solidified into a man, and turned to face her. "Oh shit, Bastion!" A heavy weight struck her in the stomach as he tossed her over his shoulder. She hadn't even seen him move. The room blurred, her stomach lurched. Sarah struggled to get her bearings as the light suddenly dimmed and cooler air buffeted her. Were they down in one of the tunnels? How had he known about the tunnels? Heart racing, hands shaking, she reached under her shirt, withdrew the Glock. He must not have noticed. In his hurry, aimed at the dark blurs she assumed were his legs and fired twice. The tunnel abruptly swam into focus as his momentum stalled and blood spurted from both of his hamstrings. Bastion stumbled and went down. Sarah went down with him. Her back hit the ground first and knocked the breath from her, her head ricocheting off the hard-packed dirt. She slid several yards, then skidded to a halt. Dust rose up around her, choking her, making her cough. She groaned as her head began to throb. Rolling to her side, Sarah fought to breathe and ignored the bright sparkles that danced through her vision. Sluggishly, she dragged herself to her feet and glanced around. The tunnel they were in, like all the others, was dimly lit with low wattage bulbs activated by motion sensors. She couldn't see the exit, so this must be one of the longer tunnels. Bastion rose up between her and the entrance, one hand clamped to the back of his right thigh. Sarah looked around frantically for the Glock she had dropped upon impact, spotting it a couple of feet in front of her to the right. She dove for it. Bastion snatched it away before she was even halfway there. As Sarah jumped back, he turned and hurled it all the way to the entrance. His eyes, when he turned to face her, glowed amber with rage. "Apparently, your immortal friends didn't bother to tell you that shooting vampires doesn't kill us." His lips pulled back from sharp fangs, igniting fear within her. "It only pisses us off," she screamed when he raced toward her, expecting him to rip out her throat in retribution. His shoulder hit her stomach, lifted. The tunnel blurred. A cool wind whipped her as she dangled upside down. Again, blood rushed to her head, increasing. The pounding in at the bullet wounds weren't even slowing him. Fear made Sarah's pulse drum loudly in her ears. She couldn't let him take her. He'd kill her if he did, or worse, use her to kill Roland. Her breath coming in panic gasps, she reached into one of the few pockets still accessible in this position, and withdrew a throwing knife. Grasping the wooden handle tightly, she held her breath, drew her arm back, then thrust it down as hard as she could. Bastian cried out and jerked to a halt. Sarah kept going, flying forward for a long, weightless moment, until she slammed into a wall. She heard a loud crack as she hit hard dirt or stone. Pain spiked through her head, landing in a heap on the floor. She closed her eyes and gritted her teeth. Dizziness assailed her, nausea arose. When she opened her eyes, they refused to focus. Drawing her knees up under her, she braced a trembling hand against the wall and struggled to rise. Bastian was an obscure blur a few yards away, though she thought he was standing still. "You stabbed me in the ass," he roared. The pain in her head intensified. Tears spilled over her lashes and down her cheeks as she fought to remain upright. Bastian stared in furious disbelief at the bloody knife he had just yanked out of his right butt cheek. Was the woman insane? Didn't she understand who and what she was dealing with? Tossing it the way of the Glock, he sent her a look that in the past had been known to make grown men wet their pants. It didn't seem to faze her in the least. Though she was crying, he noticed uncomfortably. Hell, he'd rather have her fight him than cry. He never had been able to abide a woman's tears. "How many damned weapons are you carrying?" he demanded, hardening his heart. She was a pawn, nothing more, a temporary thorn in his side he would use to bring his enemy down. Peering around blearily, she abruptly slid down the wall, landing hard on her ass. Her arms settled limply at her sides. He frowned. Sarah, she didn't respond, just sat there blinking hard as if something was wrong with her eyes. When a small stream of crimson liquid emerged from one ear, a cold chill shivered down his spine. "Oh shit!" Bastian swiftly closed the distance between them and knelt before her. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Slipping a hand around to the back of her head, he found it wet with blood. They had been traveling at a good velocity. When she had stabbed him, he hadn't meant to lose his hold on her, but he had had a 4-inch blade stuck in his ass. Had she hit the wall hard enough to fracture her skull? Damn it, she wasn't supposed to have gotten hurt. She was supposed to have come along docile to terrified to fight and lured Roland into a trap. Then once the asshole was dead, Bastian would have released her, and she would have gone on her merry mortal way. "Sarah," he repeated softly, trying to get her to focus on him. "Sarah," what she whispered. She was totally out of it. Through his touch, he could feel her pain and confusion. She wanted Roland, probably wanted him to heal her, since Bastian's research indicated Roland could heal with his hands, not that he would. Performing a quick search of her pockets, Bastian relieved her of the rest of her arsenal of weapons. His mind raced as he pulled a mask from his front pocket and jerked it on, though it wasn't as fancy as those the Immortals had been wearing when they had left. It would protect him from the worst of the sun's damage, and what it didn't block the route through dense forest. He had carefully plotted with slipping one arm around Sarah's back and the other beneath her knees. He gently scooped her up into his arms. "Roland," she murmured plaintively. "Easy, princess," he soothed, positioning them beneath the exit. "You'll see him soon." Roland peered over Marcus's shoulder as they watched for the satellite image to appear on the small screen. They had left Chris's van a couple of miles away, and approaching stealthily on foot, had arrived in the forest that overlooked Bastian's farmhouse 5 minutes ago. Though the satellite image was due any minute, the wait was excruciating. Roland continued to feel uneasy about leaving Sarah with only mortals to protect her. Lizette offered him a sympathetic smile. "I'm sure she's fine." Roland, was she reading his thoughts? Etienne nodded, eyeing him as if he were an exhibit in a damned science fair. Seth continued to stare through the brush at the vampire's lair. "Okay, here it comes," Marcus said, drawing their attention as Roland and the others gathered around him. An image similar to that Chris had shown them at the meeting appeared on the small screen. Vampires showed up as violet blobs. The humans showed up yellow. The red blob was notably absent. Roland scowled. "Where the hell is Bastian?" Frowning, Marcus touched the screen. "I don't know." Hang on. The image doubled, then tripled in size as Roland watched dread rising inside him. Marcus searched the image quadrant by quadrant and confirmed Bastian's absence. "He isn't there." Marcus glanced at the others. "Do you think he heard us coming and bolted?" Seth shook his head. "I would have heard him." Something like panic struck Roland, tightening around his heart like a fist. "He's gone after Sarah. We don't know, that ATN cautioned. Just as Seth's head snapped around. What is it? Lisette asked. Then they all heard it. A black-clad figure shot from the forest on the far side of the house and entered the back door with preternatural speed. Though the man's face was covered by a mask, Roland knew it was Bastian. Anyone get a look at what he was carrying, Marcus? Asked. Assent came to Roland on the breeze. Fangs burst from his gums, and all rational thought fled as rage engulfed him. It's Sarah, and she was bleeding. Moments later, he was tearing the front door off the farmhouse and sprinting inside. To humans jumping up from the sofa when ignored as he darted past them and flew down the stairs to the basement. The large main room was empty and offered up for hallways from which he could choose. Roland didn't hesitate, charging through. The only one on the right and plunging into darkness. His eyes had no trouble piercing almost immediately. The hallway branched off into a number of others, forming an intricate maze that would have slowed Roland substantially if Bastian hadn't been carrying Sarah. Her scent lit his way like a candle, guiding him unerringly through an endless series of twists and turns. Awakened vampires, Bastian bellowed ahead of him. The Immortals have found us. Roland's heart slammed against his ribs as he continued forward at top speed. The sounds of battle soon broke out behind him. Gunshots sounded above. How badly was Sarah hurt? Was she dying? Was she afraid? Did she know he was coming? Would she ever forgive him? How could he have left her like that? Why had he risked it? Bastian was nothing to him. Sarah was everything. He would kill Bastian for hurting her, for touching her, for even looking at her fucking cross-eyed. What had he done to her? How badly had he hurt her? Was she suffering? She couldn't die. Roland wouldn't let her, couldn't lose her. Light bloomed ahead there, up into the left, head down, fangs gleaming. Roland charged forward. Lisette groaned as she watched Roland cover the distance to the farmhouse's front door. In a blink, rip it off its hinges and vanish inside. So much for stealth. All but Seth hastily donned their masks. Awakened vampires, a voice bellowed within. The Immortals have found us. How many did you count? Seth asked grimly. 57 vamps below, Marcus said. For humans above. If you can prevent Roland from killing Sebastian, do so. Seth raced for the farmhouse first, followed by Marcus, then Lisette and Etienne. The French Immortals burst inside, just as the first to vanish through the door that led to the basement. Two human minions stood gaping in front of a threadbare sofa. Lisette nodded to her brother. Go on, I'll see to the humans. He vanished in a blur as she turned to face the minions. They drew handguns and fired. Lisette ducked to the side, slipped behind them, and snapped both their necks. She had been born with the ability to read others' thoughts, and theirs had been seriously sadistic. I hope Bastian was oblivious to your true nature, she murmured. Because if he wasn't, he isn't worth saving. Another of their ilk came running from the kitchen, guns blazing. He died quickly too. As the sounds of battle rose from below, she sped down a hallway to the room that had contained the last yellow blob from the satellite image and kicked the door open. The room was a combination home, office, and library. The sole occupant was roughly 6 feet tall, blonde and blue-eyed, with a handsome youthful face and world-weary eyes. Lisette guessed he was around 35, and after rapidly scanning his thoughts, definitely worth salvaging. Who the hell are you? He demanded, yanking earbuds, blasting metal music out of his ears when the sounds of violence trickled in through the door. He drew a 9mm and pointed it at her. What the hell is going on? Lisette pulled her mask off and drew in a deep breath. Damn thing made her feel like she was suffocating. Male appreciation wafted over her, smiling with a flash of fame. She tucked the mask in her belt. You might as well put that away, she advised, nodding at the gun. His eyes widened and his mouth came dangerously close to falling open. There are female vampires, she chuckled. Of course there are, but fortunately for you, I am not vampire. Otherwise I would have already ripped out your throat. He paled. You're one of them. Define them, she said, strolling toward him across the long, narrow room. Immortal guardians, he sneered. She shook her head. I see you are as confused as your employer, as Bastian will soon learn. We are the good guys, you're murderers, she shrugged. We only kill those who prey upon the innocent. Vampires, on the other hand, kill anyone who strikes their fancy. That's not true. He grabbed some papers off the desk with his free hand and held them up. Bastian's vampires only kill pedophiles. She tilted her head to the side, like the one who murdered your son. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down. How do you know about But the vampires didn't just kill the men on that list, they killed the men's wives, sons, daughters, grandchildren, and many others who were either oblivious to those men's sickness or had been victimized by it themselves. That's that. Can't be. Bastion wouldn't allow that. Bastion doesn't know that's why we're here. We've seen the police reports and intend to put a stop to it. A masculine voice cleared in her head. I hate to interrupt your little chat, her brother said, but Roland has gone off to kill Bastion, leaving Seth, Marcus, and I to face the 57 vampires spewing forth from the hallways down here. So if you wouldn't mind wrapping it up, we could really use some help. Lisette grinned. The blonde eyed her warily and took a step back. Why are you smiling? I'm afraid my brother has summoned me. Time's up. Before he could blink, she leapt over the desk, knocked the gun from his grasp, and yanked the computer's power cord from the wall. Relax, she said as she easily restrained him long enough to bind his hands behind his back. I'm not going to kill you. Shoving him into his chair, she yanked the Ethernet cord from both the wall and the computer and bound his ankles as well. You can't just leave me like this, he said somewhat desperately as she tied it off. If you're telling the truth, won't the vampires kill me if they find me like this? And Bastion isn't around to stop them. Don't worry. She gave his knee a pat as she rose. When we're finished here, there won't be any vampires left. A little faster, please, her brother grumbled. I'm on my way. Chapter 17. Roland surged into a square room with cement walls that opened onto a smaller room on the opposite side. Unlike the heart of the basement, which had been furnished like a living room/game room, this chamber boasted only a single tattered armchair. The next room appeared to be empty except for the thick chains and heavy manacles attached to one wall. Bastion was leaning over Sarah, who was seated in the chair, and sensed Roland launched himself at the bastard, knocking him away from her and into the wall beyond Sarah. He called. She didn't answer. Grabbing Bastion by the neck, he hurled him across the room and into the wall with such force that a crater formed in it. Roland risked a quick glance at her. She was slumped in the chair, eyes closed, hair falling forward to conceal much of her face. Sarah, he glimpsed none of the blood he smelled, and didn't think there was a large quantity of it. Had Bastion drunk from her? Was that why she wouldn't rouse? Had Bastion attempted to drain her? Roland couldn't see her neck for her hair, but feared that was it roaring his fury. He drew his sigh. Don't kill him. Seth's voice spoke in his head. He hurts Sarah. All bets are off. As a stunned Bastion, who clearly hadn't expected Roland to negotiate his maze so swiftly, picked himself up off the ground. Roland leapt the distance between them and swung mere inches from Bastion's neck. The sigh rebounded as though they had struck a shield. I said don't kill him, Seth spoke uncompromising. Damn you, Roland snarled, arms smarting as he watched Bastion stumble backward and draw two short swords. Beat him, bruise him, maim him, if you must, but leave him alive. Roland, this is non-negotiable. Bastion swung, metal clashed. The younger immortal didn't have a hope in hell of emerging the victor. Roland was 700 years older, 700 years stronger, and swifter. For every gash Bastion inflicted, Roland scored for and relished every one. He was relentless, constantly pressing forward, forcing Bastion onto the defensive, keeping his body between his opponent and Sarah at all times. Dodging one of Bastion's swings, Roland kicked the sword from his hand, then slashed open Bastion's forehead and cheek, barely missing his eye. Blood gushed, partly blinding the prick as he brought his other sword up into Roland's side. Roland didn't even flinch, just shoved him back and kept hammering away, cutting and hitting and kicking the crap out of him. Bastion's other sword went flying, dropping one of his scythe. Roland grabbed Bastion by the hair, swung him around and slammed him face first into the wall. Dust and cement slivers erupted outward. What did you do to her? He growled when Bastion struggled. Roland drew the immortal's head back and slammed his face into the wall again. Cement cracked. Bones snapped. Blood spurted from Bastion's nose. What did you do to her? Fuck you, Bastion bit out, spitting blood. Yanking him back, Roland hurled him bodily into the next room. Bastion hit the wall, forming a lightning bolt-shaped crevice in it, then fell to the floor. Roland crossed to him in an instant, jerked him to his feet, shoving him back against the wall. With a hand clamped around his throat, he pressed the tip of his side to Bastion's chest. Bastion grabbed the hand, holding The sighed and strained to keep it at bay. The blade penetrated skin, pressed forward into muscle. "Every minute you fight me," Bastion choked out. Takes her closer to death, panic piercing him. Roland glanced over his shoulder at Sarah. She was still slumped, unmoving against the cushions, careful not to strike the heart or any major arteries. Roland drove the blade home. Bastion cried out in agony. It may not kill him, but it would sure as hell slow him down. Roland withdrew the blade, hurried into the other room, and knelt before Sarah. Dropping the sigh, he cupped her face with bloody hands that trembled. "Sarah," he called softly. He could see no bite marks on her neck, but could tell by her erratic heartbeat that something was seriously wrong. "Sarah," sweetling, "open your eyes and answer me." Her eyelids fluttered, then rose slowly. Her eyebrows drew together in a pained V. Roland was so relieved to get a response from her that he damned near burst into tears. "That's it, love. Let me see those pretty eyes." She kept blinking hard and seemed to have difficulty focusing. "Roland," she whispered weakly. "Yes, love, it's me." As her gaze wandered, he gently drew back first one eyelid, then the other. His heart sank. Her right pupil was dilated, the left one wasn't. "My head." Pushing his hand away, she closed her eyes. Roland brushed her bangs back, found no lump, checked her temples, the left side of her head. When he pulled back the hair on her right side and saw the blood coming from her ear, his insides went cold. Edward's ears had bled as he died, tunneling his fingers through the dusty strands. Roland cautiously examined her scalp until he met with more blood in the back. She moaned when he settled his hands over the wound. "I'm sorry," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Just sit still. The pain will be gone soon, I promise." His gift showed him the skull fracture, the hemorrhaging, the pressure it was causing that would kill her if it wasn't relieved soon. The brain damage she had already sustained. When fury boiled up inside him anew, he vanquished it and forced himself to concentrate. The wounds on his own body ceased healing as Roland directed all of his energy toward healing Sarah. His hands grew hot. Light surrounded her head like a halo. Roland's own head began to ache just a little longer. "Love." Leaving the human without another glance, Lizette sped down to the basement and stopped short at the foot of the stairs. It was like nothing she had ever seen. There were 4 hallways branching off the main room. One was empty. Etienne, Seth, and Marcus were positioned in front of the others, fighting an endless stream of vampires that flowed forth from each 2 and 3 at a time. Drawing her Glock 18s, Lizette began to fire. Blood sprayed the ceiling, walls, floor, and immortal guardians as bullets tore through major arteries. Unlike immortals, who could slip into a sort of stasis similar to that of a water bear, vampires died when they bled out, as many were doing now. The acrid odors of gunpowder, sweat, and fear permeated the room as she spent 62 rounds, and the other guardians' short swords, sais, and katanas flashed. Kneeling, she ejected the empty clips, dropped one Glock, and pulled replacements from pockets attached to her belt. A vampire left the others and lunged for her. ATN appeared in front of her and cut the vamp down. "Thanks." She slapped on the clips and rose. "I'm good." Without a word, ATN returned to his hallway. Lizette took out every vamp that sought the stairs or went for ATN's back and did the same for Marcus and Seth. The bodies began to pile up. The room turned red with blood, and still the vampires kept coming. Bastion sank to his knees and probably would have fallen farther if he hadn't grabbed one of the chains, bolted to the wall, and clung to it every time he drew a breath. It felt as if Roland were plunging that sigh into his chest again. He was in trouble. He had seriously underestimated Roland and didn't see how he was going to make it out of this alive. Judging by the sounds of things, his men weren't faring any better. How had Roland become so powerful? The immortal Bastion had killed in Scotland hadn't been anywhere near this fast or strong. It had happened years ago. Bastion had been feeding upon a woman who sold orphan children to brothels, fully intending to drain her dry. When the Scottish immortal had pounced, the fight had lasted a lot longer than this one probably would, and had left Bastion laid up for 3 days. But he had won. He had killed the asshole and assumed Roland's skills would be roughly the same. When he and his men had ambushed Roland in groups, he had realized that Roland was stronger than he had previously believed, but he had imagined him capable of nothing close to this today. He was unstoppable, unbeatable, carving Bastion up at will and blocking his expert swings and thrusts not only with his wicked sigh but with bursts of telekinetic energy. His gaze glued to the couple in the next room, Bastion tightened his grip on the chain and pulled himself painfully to his feet. It wasn't just Roland's astounding power that had caught him off guard. However, there were other things his gift told him that just didn't add up. He fought for breath when the lung Roland had punctured collapsed, then struggled to reinflate itself as the virus sapped his energy. In an attempt to repair it, Bastion's gift enabled him to read others' emotions. With a touch, Roland had been a mass of seething rage. Not surprising, Bastion had stolen his latest toy, but that rage had been tempered with fear that had metamorphosed into panic when Bastion had pointed out that Sarah was dying. Leaning against the wall, he watched Roland press his lips to Sarah's forehead and cup the back of her head with care. He was gentle with her, his touch, his speech, and he was healing her. Sarah wasn't just another victim to him. Roland loved her deeply. Bastion glanced at the portrait hanging on the wall beside him, out of sight of the next room. Cold-blooded murderers didn't have those feelings, did they? And Roland hadn't killed him, though he had ample opportunity to do so. Even when he had punctured Bastion's lung, he had deliberately avoided nicking the heart or any major arteries. Why? Bastion had felt no intent on Roland's part to torture him at length or save him to kill at a future date. If he was the heartless murderer Bastion had long believed him to be, why hesitate? He returned his gaze to the next room and frowned. Roland's hands were glowing brightly as Bastion watched, astonished. The back of Roland's head began to glisten. Weighty and blood emerged from one ear. Bastion looked again at the portrait. Roland had just fractured his own skull to save Sarah's life. What the hell was going on? Aided by the gleaming blade of a katana, the head of Seth's opponent flew from his body and landed in the hands of the vampire behind him. The vampire looked down at his prize, then dropped it with a yelp just as Seth's other katana liberated his head to behind him or his collapsing body. 3 vampires stood immobile in the entrance of the hallway and stared at Seth with terror. Glad to have a reprieve, Seth checked on his charges to see how they were faring. Marcus and Etienne were still parked in front of the other hallways, cutting a swath through the vampires. The entrances continued to vomit forth. Lizette blocked the stairs leading out of the basement. She had run out of ammunition several minutes ago and now met any vamp who slipped past the rest of them with the lethal blades of her red Shoto swords. Marcus finished off another vamp and looked over at Seth as the body fell. How many more of these bastards are there? He asked as another came at him. Beyond Marcus, Etienne was battling the vamps of his own. Seth shrugged. I don't know, I've lost count. The bodies were piling up. All 4 immortals were covered in blood and stood up to their knees in vampire corpses afflicted with various stages of decay. The stench was overpowering. Seth returned his attention to the 3 vampires who lingered uncertainly in the entrance of the hallway he blocked. One was blonde, one was African American, one was Latino. All appeared to be in their early 20s. When they seemed disinclined to move, he arched a brow while the blonde exchanged a look with the others and swallowed audibly. You guys are immortal guardians? Yes. The African American vamp shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Did you kill Bastion? No, we have no intention of killing him. Bastion is one of us. His jaw dropped. Bastion is an immortal. Yes, he said he was a vampire like us because he thinks he is. Bastion is confused. He was fed false information by the one who transformed him. We're here to help him, not hurt him. The Latino vampire motioned belligerently to the carnage around them. Then why are you killing all of us? Bastion's vampire followers have not been confining their feeding to those on the lists they were given. They're killing innocents. I'm afraid we cannot allow such to continue. But Bastion said immortals kill innocents. The blonde spoke up. As I said, he was misinformed. Immortal guardians only kill those who prey upon the innocent, those who threaten to reveal our existence to the mortal world, and those who seek to harm us. We protect innocents. The 3 huddled together and whispered amongst themselves. Seth sheathed one katana, pulled out a throwing knife and hurled it into the throat of a vampire who had snuck past Etienne and was circling around to attack his back. According to the conversation, he had no difficulty hearing. The blonde was Joe, the African American was Cliff. And the Latino was Vincent. Joe cleared his throat. What exactly are our options here, smart vampire? How long has it been since you returned? Seth countered. 6 months, 14 for me. Cliff said about 2.5 years. Vincent said the madness didn't seem to have taken hold of them. Yet how's the bloodlust controllable? Joe answered. Cliff nodded. Same here. Vincent hesitated. It's pretty bad. I've been having thoughts lately that scare me. Have you acted upon them? No, he hasn't killed anyone who wasn't on Bastion's list, Cliff said hastily. Joe nodded. We made sure one of us is always with him. They seemed like good men. It was a damn shame they were destined to become monsters. You have two options then, gentlemen. We can either fight to the death today, your death, I'm afraid, or should you prefer it, you can be taken to one of our research facilities. You'll be given individual apartments and anything else you need to be comfortable. You will be supplied with bagged blood and food as well, but you will not be able to leave the building without an immortal escort. We can't risk your killing an innocent. Joe frowned. Research facility. Our scientists are attempting to find both a cure for the vampiric virus and a treatment that will alleviate or prevent entirely the madness that inevitably afflicts your kind. Perhaps you would like to be of some assistance, Vincent snorted. So you want us to be your guinea pigs, your lab rats? Look, Cliff said, if there's a chance they can keep us from going crazy, it's worth it. I agree, Joe said somberly, but we'd be like their prisoners. Vincent protested. A tense silence ensued. Seth threw another knife. Joe shook his head. Killing pedophiles is one thing. I don't want to end up killing women and kids and people who aren't violent criminals. If being locked up is the only way to ensure I don't. Cliff nodded. Yeah, I don't want to end up like the one who turned me. He didn't just feed on people, he tortured them. The guy who turned me tortured people, to Vince admitted reluctantly. So did mine, Joe added. Seth lobbed another knife at one of the vamps fighting Lizette. You won't be treated badly, he assured them, and should we not be able to help you when the madness grows too uncomfortable, you can choose your own end. We won't force you to linger in such a state. To do so would be to truly turn them into lab rats and would endanger the humans at the facility. The three stared at each other. A somber moment. Fine, Vincent said finally, let's do it. Seth sheathed his other katana. I don't have any rope with which to restrain you, so sorry about this. Three carefully placed lightning quick jabs, backed by Seth's superior preternatural strength, knocked them all unconscious. Grabbing the fronts of their shirts before they could fall, he eased them down to the ground. A quick look and listen confirmed that the hallway behind them was devoid of further vampires. They must have been the last two. Roused, drawing his katanas once more, Seth stepped over the mounds of bodies that had dropped around him and headed over to aid Marcus Atten and Lizette. The vice that was clamped around Sarah's head loosened gradually. The throbbing that made it feel as if a spike were being driven through her skull eased. Sighing with relief, she opened her eyes. Vision that was initially hazy cleared and showed her Roland kneeling in front of her with his eyes closed. No wonder her headache was going away. He was holding a heating pad to the back of her head. Smiling gratefully, she reached out to touch his face and froze. Blood was seeping slowly from his ear, more saturated the collar at the back of his neck. Lines of pain bracketed his eyes and mouth as a muscle clenched and unclenched in his jaw. Oh no, 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 no. He was healing her. She must have hit her head, or she didn't know. She couldn't remember. Reaching up, she tugged at his wrists and looked around wildly. Where the hell were they? The last thing she recalled was rubbing Nietzsche's tummy. Now they were in a windowless room with blood-spattered cracked walls, and terror gripped her. Bastion was in the next room, staring at them with glowing amber eyes. Sarah pulled harder on Roland's arms, but couldn't break his hold. Roland, stop. What are you doing? Bastion's face was a bloody mess. A deep laceration creased one side from forehead to jawline. His nose was broken, his chin completely crimson. Too many cuts to count marred the rest of him. He swayed where he stood. Nevertheless, he scared the crap out of her. As he shuffled forward and bent to pick up a sword that lay on the ground, Sarah tore her gaze away from him and began to struggle violently. Roland, stop. Roland was bleeding from several wounds Bastion must have inflicted. Healing her was diverting much-needed energy away from stopping blood loss that would weaken him. By the looks of it, he was already weak enough that her head wound had opened on him and was leeching more of his strength. How was he going to be able to defend Himself, Roland's large hands wouldn't budge no matter how strongly Sarah fought. Her throat thickened, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Don't do this, Roland, please stop healing me. I'm fine now, you have to stop healing me." His brow creased. As his lashes lifted, when his eyes met hers, she bit back a sob. They should have been glowing amber from his skirmish with Bastion. Instead they were brown, and one pupil was much larger than the other. "You have to stop, baby," she whispered. Hoarsely cupping his face and trembling hands, "For me, please stop." He withdrew his hands, the heat faded away. Sarah cried out when he toppled sideways and hit the floor, flinging herself from the chair. She knelt over him. "Roland, I'm okay," he murmured, bracing his hands on the floor. He pushed himself up to sit with his back against the wall. "I just lost my balance for a second." His voice was weak, pained. "What have you done?" When I had to. Reaching up, he stroked her cheek with bloody fingers. "I couldn't lose you." She covered his hand with hers and held it to her face. "But Bastion is coming." She could hear his dragging footsteps entering the room behind her. Roland glanced over her shoulder, expression hardening. "Help me up, Roland, help me up." Sarah swearing silently, she wrapped her arms around his waist, and thigh muscles straining helped heave him to his feet. Roland leaned against the wall and glared daggers at Bastion. Sarah looked back and forth between them and thought they both looked as weak as kittens. Yet recent experience had taught her that when it came to vampires and immortals, looks could be deceiving. "You fractured her skull," Roland growled furiously. Sarah looked up at him in surprise. Was that why her head had hurt so badly? Why she couldn't recall what had happened? No wonder healing her had taken so much out of him. "I didn't mean to drop her," Bastion snapped, surprising her even more. "I was running with her over my shoulder when she stabbed me in the ass." Her eyebrows rose. Roland's lips twitched as he lowered his gaze to meet hers. "You stabbed him in the ass?" Sarah shrugged. "I don't remember." She wasn't sure why Bastion felt the need to offer an explanation. He still seemed intent on killing Roland, moving steadily closer with drunken steps. Sarah bent and retrieved Roland's scythe and positioned herself in front of him, feet braced for an attack. Bastion shook his head. "Step aside, Sarah. This is between me and Roland." "What is?" she challenged angrily. "Why are you doing this?" Bastion turned his head and spat blood, then pointed his blade at Roland. "He killed my sister." She sucked in a shocked breath. "What?" Roland asked behind her. "You killed my sister, you bloody bastard." Drawing on what little strength remained, Bastion attacked with a burst of preternatural speed. Roland grabbed his side and shoved Sarah aside. Blades clashed, and the battle resumed, slowed nearly to mortal speed by the toll their wounds had taken. It took only moments for Bastion to perceive he would lose. Roland's swings gained in strength as his own continued to weaken, driving him incessantly backward. Every breath was like a knife in his chest. "Was she a vampire's minion?" Roland asked through gritted teeth. "She was an innocent," Bastion denied furiously. Roland's sigh connected with his sword, swung and propelled it out of his hand. It landed with a clatter on the far side of the room where Sarah hurriedly claimed it. "Then I didn't kill her," Roland insisted evenly that he would deny it after savaging caught the way he had infuriated Bastion. With no other weapon left him, he drove his fist into Roland's temple. It must have hurt like hell. On top of the skull fracture, Bastion heard Sarah cry out. Roland's eyes flashed from brown to glowing amber. A second later, pain crashed through Bastion's back as Roland hurled him into the wall with the chains in the next room and pinned him there, one of the manacles digging into his shoulder blade with a hand at his throat. "It wasn't me, Bastion. The only innocents I have ever killed were my wife and my brother." "Bullshit," Sarah blurted from the other room. Bastion felt Roland's surprise and confusion as Sarah marched toward them. "That bitch wasn't innocent, and neither was your brother. They were the ones who handed you over to the vampire who turned you." "Damn it, Roland, I told you to stop feeling guilty about that." Love and amusement replaced Roland's confusion, but couldn't quite blot out old guilt. "I stand corrected," he drawled. "They weren't innocent." When Roland's grip loosened, Bastion drew in several jagged breaths and rested a moment in hopes of rebuilding a final burst of strength. "My sister was innocent. She knew nothing of this world, yet you killed her. Is that her?" Sarah asked, motioning to the painting. "It was a portrait of Kot and her husband Blaze." "Yes." He waited for Roland's reaction As he looked at it, knowing his gift would tell him the truth regardless of any lies the immortal may spout. I don't know her, Roland said simply. Bastian frowned. Unless his gift was failing him, Roland truly did not recall seeing her. Then there it was, a spark of recognition. You're lying, I can feel it. You recognize her? Roland's expression darkened as he stared at the painting. Not her, him. Who was he? Her husband. He was like a brother to me. You turned him after you ripped her throat out and made him watch her die. Roland looked at him sharply. Who told you that he did? He lied. Bastian, and all my 9 and a to centuries of living, I have never transformed a human. Bastian stared at him in confusion. He was telling the truth, or seemed to be. He hadn't turned blaze. Then the rest of Roland's words hit him. 9 and a to centuries? Yes, that's impossible. No, it isn't. There's an immortal fighting your men right now who is a millennium older than I. Immortals live far longer than vampires. Because you kill them, he countered, incensed. Not all of them, he denied, annoyingly calm. We aren't everywhere, Bastian. Vampires have always dramatically outnumbered us, finding safe havens wherever they could thrive unchallenged. Even so, the oldest vampire I have ever heard mention of had been a vampire a mere 79 years. What of me? I was transformed centuries ago. Roland sighed, and releasing his hold, stepped back. You aren't a vampire, you're an immortal. Bastian almost laughed. Now I know you're lying. He wasn't an immortal. He hated immortals, had despised them ever since he had found a hysterical Blaze weeping over Cot's torn and bloody body, and learned that an immortal had killed her. It's true, Sarah interjected softly. When Bastian looked at her, he felt a stab of unease. There was pity in her gaze. That's why Roland and the others haven't killed you. You're one of them, Bastian. They just didn't know it until after you attacked him. A sick feeling slithered through him as he recalled the way Roland had intentionally avoided striking a killing blow. Though he had scored numerous hits during the fight, not one of the wounds Roland had spawned was fatal. I'm a vampire, he insisted. The fact that none of them had ever met another 200-year-old vampire didn't mean they didn't exist. It couldn't. You were different even as a human, Roland went on. Possessed gifts or abilities you hid from others. Gifts your friend Blaze did not. How did he know that? Perhaps you read minds or can discern the emotions of others. With a touch, Bastian's heart began to pound. Roland was studying him intently. All immortals were different as humans. No doubt your sister had special gifts as well. She had been born with psychometric abilities, receiving glimpses of past events that were related to objects she touched. Except immortals were never human, Bastian uttered numbly. There, your DNA is different from ours. Roland's gaze sharpened. That isn't common knowledge amongst vampires. How did you know that I took a sample of your blood? Remember, I had it tested. Roland exchanged a grim glance with Sarah, by whom a biochemist who is helping me search for a cure. He said you were different, that you aren't human and never were. If he didn't say the same of you, then he hasn't tested your blood. Yet he hadn't always nervous around Bastian. Keegan had said Casey's blood would suffice. Have you ever met a vampire who had gifts like yours? Not one. But Bastian didn't say so. All immortals possess them, though the gifts differ from person to person. They did not acquire them after the transformation. They were born with them, as you were. Sarah took a step forward, then stopped when Roland motioned for her to stay back. You even look like them, Bastian. Same hair, same eyes, same features. It sounded as if she thought he was lucky. What was that about? Mentally, he shook himself. It doesn't matter whether I'm vampire or immortal. The hell it didn't. Roland killed my sister and turned her husband. I've never seen that woman before, Roland shouted. Sarah waved the sword to gain their attention. Your friend told you Roland turned him? Yes. He mentioned Roland specifically by name. Roland made a sound of irritation. He already said he did. Sarah, no he didn't. I know you're grumpy, honey, but be patient and let me finish. Bastian was shocked when Roland immediately backed down. Bastian, did your brother-in-law mention Roland by name when he told you what had happened and that he had been transformed? He didn't know Roland's name. Then only his face. He curled his lip as he eyed Roland distastefully. He said he'd never forget it as long as he lived. Sarah spoke before Roland could. When did he tell you? It was Roland 5 years later. We were in London. Blaze had been out feeding and Returned white as a sheet, he said he had seen the one who turned him, and over the next 2 weeks claimed the Immortal was hunting him. The Nightblaze was killed. I arrived as Roland was leaving, and later uncovered his name myself. Well, isn't that convenient? Roland said contemptuously. For years he couldn't tell you who transformed him, then suddenly decided it was me when he realized I was hunting his sorry ass. Your friend was full of shit. He was slaughtering women in the Rookery. When I followed the trail of bodies to him, he got scared and pointed his finger at me, probably hoping you'd kill me. Bullshit. He wasn't the one killing women. You were, and Roland had started by killing Sweet Cat. Roland emitted a mocking laugh. I suppose he told you that. Sebastian swung at him, wanting to knock the disparaging smile from Roland's face. Roland dodged his fist, then shoved him up against the wall again. Raising his sigh, Roland pressed the tip to Bastian's chest above his uninjured lung. Did he also tell you I found him crouched over a pregnant woman whose throat was missing? Her blood was all over his face, her pulse gone, the babe in her belly dead. He leaned closer, eyes cold as ice. Now we can be a family again, he was telling her. We'll be together for eternity. Catherine, you, me, and the baby. The sick bastard had tried to turn a pregnant woman, but driven by bloodlust had savaged her throat too badly. Instead, Bastian's heart began to pound. No hint of deception bled forth from Roland. There was irritation over Bastian's refusal to listen, disgust over Blaze's actions, and anger over the death of the woman and her babe, yet nothing that indicated he wasn't telling the absolute truth. And there were others. Roland persisted. At least 6 other women murdered just in the 2 weeks I hunted him. Mouth suddenly dry, Bastian forced himself to speak. Were they pregnant? The last 3 were, noticeably if the earlier victims were. You couldn't tell by looking, and I didn't check. Something inside Bastian started to crumble. His disbelief, his faith in his friend. He felt sick. It couldn't be true. It couldn't. Everything that had driven him for the past 200 years could not have been a lie. What is it? Sarah asked cautiously. He met her gaze, wondered if the pain and nausea invading him now was similar to that she must have felt when she had hit her head. Kat was pregnant when she died. Sarah bit her lip, her eyes turning sorrowful. Your sister's name was Kat, short for Catherine. Roland sighed heavily and stepped back. Bastian met the Immortal's gaze. If you didn't kill her, who did? Roland shook his head regretfully. You already know the answer to that. Blaze. Chapter 18. Sarah watched the emotions flooding across Bastian's battered face. Even though she was angry at him for kidnapping her and trying to kill Roland, she couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He had been trying to avenge his sister's death, and instead had learned that his brother-in-law and best friend was the one who had murdered her. And he had his enemy to thank for bringing him to justice. What a mess. Why? He asked Roland. Why would he kill her? He loved her. I know he did. The bloodlust is very strong in the beginning, even stronger in vampires than it is in us. Roland shook his head. He may have only intended to take a sip and lost control. It's how I killed my wife. Sarah wished she could find a way to erase that memory for him. Seth, Marcus, Lizette, and ATN entered the next room. Their faces were Jackson Pollocked, with scarlet streaks and blotches. Lizette and ATN's rubber suits glistened whitely and sported numerous neat cuts. Marcus's clothing was torn in several places and boasted large damp patches. Seth's clothes, though stained, were completely intact. All 4 from the knees down looked as though they had waded through a vat of blood. As they strolled forward to stand just inside the entrance of the small room Sarah, Roland, and Bastian occupied, Bastian stiffened and straightened his shoulders. Marcus took in the chains on the wall, as well as Roland and Bastian's bloody dishevelment. With speculative eyes, Lizette moved to stand beside Sarah. Are you all right? She nodded. How about you? I could use a shower. Bastian stared at Seth. You're the day walker? Yes. Seth looked past Sarah at the painting, his face grim. I know this comes inexcusably late. He met Bastian's combative gaze. But I would like to offer my sincere condolences on the death of your sister. Bastian's look turned uncertain. Seth's words, his expression, his body language broadcasted nothing but genuine regret. Kindness was surely the last thing Bastian had expected from the leader of the Immortal Guardians. Where are my men? Bastian asked in a low voice. Are they your men? Marcus asked. Did you transform them? When Bastian refused to answer, Seth said no, he recruited them after others transformed, then abandoned them. Where are my men? He asked again. Marcus, Lisette, and Etienne looked away. They're dead, Seth informed him flatly. Bastion blanched. All of them. Sarah wondered how close he had been to them, if he had considered them his friends, all but one of the humans. You said you didn't kill humans, Bastion shouted, turning on Roland. Before Seth could finish, I said we didn't kill innocents, Roland corrected. Lizette nodded. And those men were not innocent, Bastion. They were depraved. They just hid it well. Bastion shook his head, his face full of denial. What about the vampires? Did you kill them to all? But 3, Seth acknowledged. The next thing Sarah knew, Bastion was beside her, yanking the sword from her hands and swinging it at Seth. With phenomenal speed, Seth vanished. Before the blade could strike home, the other Immortals lunged at Bastion, then stopped short when Seth reappeared behind him, wrapping one arm around the younger Immortal's chest and sword arm, and the other around his neck. He deftly restrained him. Etienne, you and Lizette take the vampires, and the humans we spared to the network. They are to be guarded at all times, but treated well. I'll call later with further instructions. The network. Sarah's eyes widened. Chris, she had forgotten all about him. He had been guarding her when Bastion had taken her. Had Bastion were Chris and his men, that she couldn't remember what had happened to Roland. Seth went on, curbing Bastion's struggles as easily as a parent would a child's. Don't kill Chris. When you see him, relief supplanted worry. Chris was okay. Then Roland's expression turned mutinous. None of us knew Bastion had found the tunnels, Seth said. Had he been aware, Chris would have been better prepared. Etienne frowned. He got in through the tunnels. Yes. Roland glared at Bastion. How the hell did you know about them? It's called surveillance, asshole. Bastion snarled. Sarah sighed. She supposed she could understand his hostility. He had just found out that Roland's friends had killed all but 4 of his. In the next instant, Seth and Bastion vanished. The tension in the room left with them. So Marcus said, someone want to clue me in. Unlike Seth and these two, he motioned to Lizette and Etienne. I can't read minds. What happened to the sister? Roland motioned to the painting. Shortly after turning vampire, her husband killed her to cover his ass. He said, I killed her, then transformed him. Hence Bastion's thirst for revenge. Marcus stared at the figures in the portrait. She was Bastion's sister. Roland frowned. You knew her? He looked uneasy. No, but you recognize her? How? Trailing off, Roland groaned. Don't tell me. Marcus nodded. She was at your house the afternoon it burned down, and she was standing in the corner just now when we came in. Everyone followed his gaze to the empty corner opposite the portrait. A chill skittered down Sarah's spine. Roland had told her Marcus could see dead people. Had Catherine's ghost been there watching the whole time? Is she still there? Lysette asked uncomfortably. No, she vanished when Seth and Bastion did. Shoulders drooping wearily, Roland dropped his scycross to Sarah and took her in his arms. Sarah clung to him, glad it was finally over. As Roland rested his cheek atop her hair, she buried her face in his chest behind them. Etienne spoke. Marcus, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. That shit is creepy. The moment Seth teleported Bastion and himself into the massive entrance hall of his castle in England, he released him, stumbling forward several steps. The newly discovered immortal swung around and raised his sword, what his faintly glowing gaze scoured his surroundings. What did you do? Where are we? My home. Seth told him. One of them. Anyway, where are the others? Still in your basement where we left them. Why have you brought me here? Seth read Sebastian's mind without difficulty, feeling only slightly guilty for the intrusion. His new charge thought Seth was going to kill him and was digging deep to find strength enough to fight him. I didn't bring you here to harm you, Sebastian. I brought you here to do what I should have done during the first few weeks after you were transformed, help you understand who and what you are, and aid you in making a new life for yourself. Sebastian barked out a bitter laugh. Are you kidding me? I had a life, I had a purpose, people I cared about, people I was trying to help, and you just slaughtered them all. David entered from the kitchen, munching an apple, sword held out defensively in front of him. Sebastian angled his body so that he faced both of them. Your back, David commented, studying Sebastian curiously and with a complete lack of fear or concern over his weapon. How did it go? It went, Seth replied. You may have cared for the men you commanded, Sebastian, but they didn't care for you. They were using you, taking advantage of the safety you provided. They were not your friends, and I'm supposed to believe you? Anger rolled off him in waves. Yes, I tried to kill one of your own too. If you count Marcus, hell, I thought I had amassed an army large enough to kill you all when you came for Sarah. Yet you expect me to just take your word for it that everyone I have associated with for the past 2 centuries has lied to me, everyone. But before we spared David glanced at Seth. You found 4 that were salvageable. Yes, Darnell entered from the living room / great hall. What's going on? Sebastian stared, then shifted so he could keep all 3 of them in his sights. He was in his enemy's lair, trying hard to deny everything they were telling him, and expecting one or more to attack at any moment. It was about what Seth had expected, knowing the hard climb he would have ahead of him. Winning Sebastian's trust, Seth had taken care to touch many of the vampires he had fought before he killed them, leeching from them the memories of the innocent blood they had spilled and how they had hidden it from their leader. He would offer to show Sebastian the atrocities they had committed now, but thought it best to wait until the younger Immortals' head had cleared. Sebastian began to back away, swinging the sword in his watchful gaze from one to the other. A faint rustling sounded in the hallway behind him. Seth's heart nearly stopped when he realized who had made it. Sebastian swung around, roaring and raising his sword to attack the immortal he thought was sneaking up behind him. Time seemed to freeze because Seth was the most powerful immortal guardian on the planet. He kept a very tight rein on his temper, so tight very few had ever seen it unleashed. But when he looked past Sebastian and saw the mystery woman cringe in fear as she stared up at Sebastian with wide terror-filled eyes and a face devoid of color, the reins slipped with only a thought. Seth ripped the sword from Sebastian's grip and flung it away with such force it embedded itself halfway to the hilt in one of the heavy oak front doors. The stone wall beside them cracked when another thought catapulted Sebastian. After it, Sebastian grunted on impact and fell forward with a speed no other guardian could match. Seth caught him with a hand to the throat before he hit the floor and shoved him back up, feet dangling a foot or more above it. His fingers tightened, cutting off air, threatening to crush the trachea. The ground beneath them rippled as though from an earthquake. The castle itself began to rumble and vibrate. Somewhere a lamp crashed to the floor through a red haze of fury. Seth caught and held Sebastian's gaze as that one struggled to breathe. Listen closely, Sebastian Newcomb, he gritted in low, menacing tones. I will only say this once. I understand the despair coursing through you. I understand the rage that is eating away at your insides like acid. If you want to lash out at me, you are welcome to do so. You can even lash out at David and Darnell. But if you ever give me reason to believe you have been anything less than kind to the woman who resides here, I will strike your head from your body, and you will go down in history as the only immortal I have ever killed. Nod your head that you understand me. Face red from lack of air, Sebastian nodded. The ground gradually ceased its trembling. The castle quieted, his fury abating. Seth lowered Sebastian until his feet settled on the floor, then released him. Sebastian caught and sucked in great gasping breaths. Are you all right? He nodded wearily. Good. Now apologize to the woman in such a way that will make her think you no greater a threat than a newborn pup. Seth stepped aside and turned toward the mystery woman. She was barefoot again, clad in loose sky blue pajama bottoms with bright yellow smiley faces on them and a matching yellow tank top. Her narrow shoulders were hunched, her arms wrapped around her middle as she watched them anxiously. David and Darnell had moved to stand on either side of her, close but not touching. Seth felt regret suffuse Sebastian when he saw her. She looked so frail. The younger immortal felt bad for scaring her, a promising sign. Brow furrowing, Sebastian made a few futile attempts to straighten his clothes and wipe the blood from his face, then cleared his throat. Forgive me, he beseeched her gently, his voice hoarse from Seth's abuse. I did not mean to frighten you and have no desire to harm you. You startled me and I overreacted. I apologize. It won't happen again. When the woman looked to Seth, he gave her what he hoped was a reassuring smile. Returning her gaze to Sebastian, she nodded. David, would you take our guest to his room and help him get settled? Seth requested. Sure. Strolling forward, David addressed Sebastian as casually as he would an old friend. We weren't sure whether you would prefer a room above or below ground, so we prepared one of each. Both are safe for day sleeping below ground, Sebastian said uncertainly. Below ground, it is right this way. Once they were gone, Darnell ambled over and surveyed Seth carefully. "You okay?" Seth nodded, then proffered his own apology to the woman. "I'm sorry, I thought he posed no threat to you, otherwise I would not have brought him here." She nodded, her gaze lowering to take in the blood that painted his clothes. What she must think seeing him like this, and after all she had just witnessed. "Did I hear you say you spared 4 of them?" Darnell asked curiously. "Yes, 1 human and 3 vampires who have not yet succumbed to the madness like Sebastian. They were unaware of the others' actions." What are you going to do with the vamps?" he sighed. "Help them anyway. We can. Roland and Sarah and everyone else come through all right, a little banged up, but they'll be fine." Darnell looked in the direction David and their unwilling guest had gone. "Sebastian doesn't seem to appreciate your having come to his aid." "No." Seth felt a small hand touch his arm and looked down to find the mystery woman at his side staring up at him, her lips parted. "I do," she said softly. "Thank you for saving me." A tiny thread of joy wound its way through him at the sound of her voice. He smiled, smiling back. She closed her eyes, then sank limply toward the floor. Darnell leapt forward as Seth caught her and lifted her into his arms. "What is it? Is she sick?" "I don't know." Frowning, Seth swiftly carried her to her room, Darnell right on his heels. Darnell hastened to the bed and drew the covers back. Seth carefully laid her down, then sat beside her on the mattress, placing one hand on her forehead and the other on her chest. He sought the source of her unconsciousness. When he found it, he looked up at Darnell. "What is it?" Darnell asked apprehensively. "What's wrong with her?" Seth smiled. "She's sleeping." Roland and Sarah were curled up on the sofa watching the news when his cell phone rang. Retrieving it from the coffee table, he answered. What are you decent?" Seth's deep voice drawled. "Have I ever been?" Roland answered. "Riley put Sarah on the line." Frowning, he handed the phone to Sarah. "It's Seth. He wants to talk to you." Eyebrows raising, she took the phone. Hello, Sarah. "I know it tends to startle you when I pop in unannounced, so I thought I'd call and warn you this time." Roland mirrored her smile as she said, "Oh, okay, thanks. Pop away." Seth appeared just inside the front door. Roland and Sarah both stood as she returned the phone to the coffee table. "Calling ahead now?" Roland asked. "Marcus thought it would be wise. He told you?" Sarah blurted, her face reddening as Seth joined them. Apparently David had something of an open door policy. Any immortal who knew the security codes was invited to come and go at will. He always welcomed company and was so powerful he sensed their presence long before they entered, so they needn't even knock. Out of habit, Marcus had let himself in without knocking the day after they had stormed Baston's lair and inadvertently walked in on Roland and Sarah making love on the sofa. Sarah hadn't been able to look Marcus in the eyes since, without blushing as floridly as she was now. "Please tell me that didn't make it to the Immortal Guardian message boards," she begged. Seth smiled. "No, he only mentioned it to me and David, so we wouldn't intrude." She groaned. "Oh, lovely. I'm sure that went over big. Don't go home without calling first. David, they might be having sex on your couch." Roland laughed and wrapped an arm around her shoulders as she covered her red face. Seth's dark eyes danced with merriment. "Actually, we weren't given the details. He only said he had accidentally disturbed you when you were not prepared for company." Lowering her hands, Sarah stared up at Roland with rueful eyes. "Why do you even let me open my mouth?" Roland dipped his head and stole a kiss. "Because I love that mouth and it says such entertaining things." Sinking onto the sofa, he pulled her down beside him as Seth settled himself in his favorite chair across from them. Roland draped an arm across the back cushion so he could toy with Sarah's hair. 2 weeks had passed since they had cleaned out the vampire lair. Because Bastion had been unaware of some of his men's activities, Roland had worried that Sarah may not be safe in her home. It had been the site of 2 confrontations with multiple vampires, and there was no way of knowing if any of Bastion's followers had spoken with vamps who weren't under his guidance. So when she had invited Roland to come and stay with her, he had instead talked her into remaining with him at David's place until they could find a new home of their own to share. Seth had assured him that Bastion had not disclosed the location of David's home or the tunnels to anyone else. "We'd talked to Chris." Sarah said, her blush lingering. "He seems a little worried about the vampires. You guys saved me." She meandered into the room, trilled a greeting when he saw Seth, then trotted over and leaped onto his lap. Seth smiled and stroked the small furry Body with oversized hands lacking the freedom to come and go at will is a little tougher than they had expected. But I think they're adapting well. They've settled into their new apartments and are already pestering our doctors and scientists wanting to know how and when they can begin helping them. Roland wondered how many of the men and women at the research facility had ever actually met a vampire face to face. Those who worked the day shift had probably never even met Anne. Immortal, what do the doctors think of them? They're understandably wary, the whole staff is. But everyone seems to be getting along. Have they found the biochemist yet? Montrose Keegan had disappeared before the network had had a chance to confront him. Apparently his brother, one of Bastion's vampires, had managed to call and warn him. Before he was killed in the attack at the farmhouse, No Rodden has tagged his cell phone, social security number, bank account, and credit cards. But there's been no activity. He's living off the grid. Great, I understand. Tanner fit in instantly and as well liked. Sarah glanced up at him. Which one is Tanner? The human Chris inducted into the network. Oh right, Seth nodded. Once both of them have been trained, I intend to assign Tanner to be Sebastian's second. It made sense. The two were already friends and worked well together. How is Bastion? Sarah broached hesitantly. Roland was still fuming over Bastion hurting her, so she tended to avoid mentioning his name, lest she set off another rant. Not good. Seth paused while Naichi sprawled on his side, then twisted his upper body so that his head was upside down and his chest, front, paws, and chin all faced the ceiling. He doesn't eat, he doesn't feed, he is consumed with anger. Sarah frowned. Anger at whom? Everyone, I think. Roland brushed his fingers across her black t-shirt clad shoulder. Did you show him the memories you took from his vampires? Seth nodded. It only infuriated him more knowing they had found a way around his gift and lied to him, perpetrating such atrocities while he was trying to save them. Roland glanced down when Sarah rested a hand on his thigh and looked up at him. Maybe you should go see him, she suggested. He gazed at her in disbelief. What? Reaching up with her free hand, she laced her fingers through his at her shoulder. Who better for him to talk to? He's going through the same thing you did, only on a larger scale. Maybe you could help him. You're delirious, aren't you? She smiled, hazel eyes sparkling. Come on, Roland, think about it. You were betrayed by your wife and brother. He was betrayed by his brother-in-law and best friend. Seth held up a finger. Who was the one who turned him? By the way, he told Sebastian it was an accident, that he hadn't known feeding from him repeatedly would transform him. But considering his other lies, I have my doubts. You see, Sarah said, as if that proved her point. Then you were betrayed again by Mary. Bastion was betrayed by what, 70 of his closest friends? What's your point? Roland asked, hardening his heart against the sympathy that threatened it. Must be Sarah's influence. Normally he wouldn't have felt anything for Bastion, but contempt. She rolled her eyes. That you had Seth and Marcus to help you through it, unappreciative though you may have been, and Bastion probably feels like he has no one. Roland glanced at Seth, who was watching him with a neutral expression. I appreciated it, he admitted. Seth shifted his gaze to Sarah. You're good for him. She squeezed Roland's thigh and tossed him a teasing glance. I know, actually, Roland, I agree. That's one of the reasons I dropped by. I think it would help if you spoke with Sebastian. No, he hurt Sarah. It was unintentional, and he regrets it. He expected her to come along docile, not shoot him in the hamstrings and stab him in the ass. He smiled at Sarah. That made it to the message boards. Roland was guilty of that one himself when speculation had arisen on the boards regarding Sarah and the role she had played in the battle. He had posted a message for the first time ever, boasting of her quick thinking and bravery. Please, Roland, Sarah entreated, unfairly irresistible. I'll think about it, he grumbled, knowing he'd cave in the end. He could deny her nothing. You said that was one of the reasons you came by, he told Seth before she could elicit a solid yes from him. What was the other? The older immortal was quiet for a moment. Chris told me you took Sarah to the lab to have her blood tested. Roland stiffened. Every immortal he had ever heard of had either been transformed forcibly against his or her will or accidentally as a TN, and his brother Riekard had been. If Sarah, against all the odds, turned out to be a gifted one, she would be the first to actually ask to be infected. Did Seth intend to forbid it? Roland's heart thudded loudly in his ears, and Seth focused on Sarah. "You wish to be transformed?" "Yes," she answered somewhat nervously, while her grip on Roland's fingers tightened. "I want to be with Roland always." "You love him that much?" "Yes." Has he explained the negative aspects of his existence?" "Yes." Seth studied her intently to stop reading her mind. Roland snapped, wrapping his other arm around her protectively. As though that could stop it, her eyes widened. Seth shrugged. "I had to be sure she understood that she was certain." And he demanded shortly. When Seth said no more, "She does, and she is scoping Nietzsche up." He rose, then lowered the sleepy feline to the cushion he had just vacated. Roland and Sarah rose as well. It was like waiting for a judge to hand down a sentence. Sarah's arm crept around his waist, his tightened around her shoulders. One corner of Seth's lips tilted up. "You need not wait for the lab results. She's a gifted one." For a moment Roland couldn't breathe. What? Seth smiled fully. "She's a gifted one. I don't need the blood test to be sure." Sarah squealed and hugged Roland, jumping up and down until he laughed, though he was still afraid to believe it. "But she doesn't have any gifts." "Of course she does. Her dreams foretell the future." Sarah stopped jumping and stared at Seth. "They do?" she asked incredulously, continuing to cling to Roland. "Yes, you simply haven't learned to decipher them, contrary to popular belief. Prophetic dreams are only literal and the most powerful of the gifted ones, and immortals. For the rest, there are symbols that must be learned and deciphered, and the meaning of the dreams can be vague. For example, a week or so before you met Roland, you dreamed there was a large cockroach in your living room, that you had difficulty killing. The living room represented daily activities, such as work. The cockroach, due to its size, represented a substantial irritation. The next day, your student went to the head of the department and lodged a complaint against you, which had been a major irritation. She thought. A few days later, you dreamed of tornadoes. "I did," she said, amazed. "It was like in that movie The Day After Tomorrow, when all the tornadoes spiraled down and hit Los Angeles. They were all around me, and one even seemed to be chasing me. It was terrifying." Tornadoes represent great emotional turmoil, danger, and at times death, all the things that accompanied Roland when he entered your life shortly thereafter. Wow, she had never paid much attention to her dreams beyond wondering why so many people believed dreams only came in black and white when hers were always in vivid color. "I can aid you in learning how to interpret your dreams, if you wish." Realizing her mouth was hanging open, Sarah hastily closed it. "That would be great, thanks." She looked up at Roland, who was frowning. "My dreams foretell the future, so I heard." He grimaced. "Sorry about the turmoil, danger, and death thing." She smiled. "It was worth it." Roland looked to Seth. "What about the physical characteristics? They've begun to weaken a bit in the last century or so." "Nothing dramatic. Dark brown hair instead of black, hazel eyes instead of brown. Even those changes are still extremely rare, so I can be safely transformed." Sarah pressed just to be certain. "Yes." Roland's hold tightened. "You don't object? This is Sarah's decision to make, not mine. If she wishes you to transform her, you may do so whenever you choose." Now that she knew it would happen, Sarah felt both excited and nervous. Seth's features softened. "It won't be too bad. Roland will drain you until you are near death, then infuse you with his own blood. You'll feel like you have a bad case of the flu for a few days, then all will be well." He shifted his gaze to Roland. "You look as nervous as she does." Sarah glanced up and had to agree. Roland's lips tightened. "What if something goes wrong? It won't. She be fine, and I'm only a phone call away. If you have any questions or concerns, I'll leave her training up to you, if that's all right." They both nodded. "I should be going now. I need to stop by Seattle on my way home." "Thank you, Seth," Sarah said, "for everything." He smiled. "You're welcome." An instant later, he was gone. Sarah smiled up at Roland. "I'm a gifted one. I know. I can't believe it." But Sarah, he lightly clasped her upper arms and stared down at her, his expression earnest. "This doesn't have to change anything. The fact that you can be transformed doesn't mean you have to be. I don't want you to feel you. I want you to transform me." She interrupted, extreme relief blanketing his features. He slid his arms around her, lifted her feet off the floor, and twirled her around. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." She laughed, and wrapping her arms around his neck, hugged him back. "So you're happy?" He nodded, his face buried in her hair. "I wouldn't love you less if you said no, but given the choice of spending either decades with you or centuries, I'd much rather have centuries me to setting her down. He drew back slightly, touched his lips to hers first buoyantly, then tenderly. Her heart did a funny little skip when she met his faintly luminous eyes. I love you, Sarah, I love you too, so much more than she had dreamed was possible. He kissed her again, held her close. I'll leave it up to you to decide when you're ready. There's no time like the present. His face lit with surprise. Now yes, are you sure? She didn't blame him. She had expressed more than once uneasiness over how quickly all this had happened, but she felt no such uneasiness now. I'm sure I'm not going to change my mind, and the longer we put it off, the more nervous we'll both become. His lips twisted ruefully. You weren't supposed to see that you're nervous. Yes, she shrugged. I would have known even if you'd hidden it. You've never transformed anyone before, and you're a tad obsessive when it comes to preventing me from experiencing any discomfort. When his arms tightened and his face filled with dread, she patted his back comfortingly. That look right. There's why we need to go ahead and get it done. I know, Seth said, it's like having the flu, but the longer we put it off, the more we're both going to imagine it being worse. He drew in a deep breath and let it out slowly. You're right, now it is. Then thump. Roland's head snapped around at the odd noise that came from the kitchen, eyes flaring, fangs descending. He was gone before Sarah even finished tensing. It's all right, he called a second later. Come and see. Curious, she strode to the kitchen and paused just inside the entrance. The largest gift basket she had ever seen sat in the middle of the floor, decked with ribbons and bows. It was so large that if the contents were removed, she could curl up in it like a cat and take a nap. It's for us, Roland pronounced, opening a white envelope. Who's it from? As he pulled out a folded sheet of paper, she moved closer and began to pick through the basket's contents. It's from David. There were several enormous bags of organic oranges, so fragrant they made her mouth water, bottles of club soda, all natural crackers sprinkled with sea salt, icy gel packs. Seth must have told him, I'm going to transform you. David says he'll have difficulty keeping food down for a couple of days, but fresh squeezed orange juice and club soda will help, and crackers and pita chips. Sure enough, there were several bags of super crunchy baked pita chips with sea salt included. Had David known it was her favorite brand, or had it simply been a lucky guess? She looked at Roland. His eyes had lost their glow and were once more brown. His expression just this side of stunned. This is really nice, Sarah said, a little stunned herself. David didn't even know her and had only encountered Roland a few times, yet he'd opened up his home to them, told them they could stay as long as they wanted to. And now this. Roland nodded slowly. It is, she smiled. It was going to take him a while to get used to having friends rather than acquaintances. Let's put the soda and the oranges in the fridge and get the gel packs in the freezer. There was so much it took them several minutes to finish, so she broached when they were done, how are we going to do this? She was nervous. She didn't want to be, but couldn't help it. He swooped down and picked her up, one arm supporting her back, the other under her knees. First, I will carry you to our bedroom, she cooed, wrapping her arms around his neck as he left the kitchen and put action to words. I like it so far. Then I'm going to place you on our bed. She nuzzled his neck, felt a shiver ripple through him. Go on, peel your clothing off with my teeth. Her body melted at his words as he descended into the basement and made his way to their bedroom. What next? Make a slow exploration of your body with my tongue. His tongue, she thought as he crossed to the bed, his wicked tongue. And then he said, placing her gently atop the covers, as your body clenches in one of the many orgasms I intend to give you. He knelt on the mattress beside her, leaned over her, kissed the base of her neck where her pulse hammered just beneath the surface. I will bite you right here and make you mine forever, she arched against him when he drew his tongue across her skin. Don't forget the stripping me with your teeth part. He chuckled, a warm growly sound that sent excitement skittering through her. I wouldn't dare. Roland was true to his word. With teeth, tongue, and hands he aroused Sarah to a fevered pitch, distancing himself from his own desire and gently rebuffing her attempts to pleasure him. It was imperative that he keep a clear head, which meant ignoring his own needs and focusing solely on hers. And as her body writhed in orgasm for the third time, he gently sank his teeth into her throat and, exulting in the life that flowed into his body, devoured her like the monster He had so often been named Chapter 19. Okay, clearly, Seth had never had the flu. The first day of the transformation was about what Sarah had expected. Once she had regained consciousness, she had passed out while Roland was drinking from her and had no memory of him biting her. She had gradually begun to feel unwell, mild fever, chills, nausea that was sometimes assuaged by the orange juice and club soda, and other times brought it right back up again. She had tried to keep Roland from following her into the bathroom. There were just some things she'd rather he not see her do, and vomiting was one of them. But he insisted, and she rapidly grew too weak to prevent it, so he held her hair for her, physically supported her. When she needed it, loaded up her toothbrush with toothpaste once her stomach had emptied itself, and when her mouth was minty fresh again, carried her back to bed. He brought a television and a DVD player down to their room, played cards with her, read to her, regaled her with tales of his amazing past. He squeezed dozens of oranges, made sure she had plenty of fluids, soothed her aching head with gel pack after gel pack. He was wonderful patient, had an excellent bedside manner. It made her love him all the more. Then everything sort of deteriorated on the second day. Her fever rose and rose. Things got pretty hazy after that, Sarah later recalled. Very little of it, just flashes here and there of Roland's worried face, peering down at her as he urged her to drink more juice, hearing him shout, "Flew my ass. And if you aren't here in 5 fucking seconds," being submerged in an ice bath with Roland's big body behind her, his arms locked around her, both supporting her and restraining her as she thrashed about, his choked voice in her ear murmuring over and over again that he loved her, a man with the darkest skin she had ever seen, dreadlocks down to his hips, and the face of a pharaoh leaning over. Then there followed a large block of nothingness, during which her fever eventually broke midway through day 3. She awoke lucid, her stomach settled with a massive toothache. Roland, who was slumped in a chair by the bed with one of her hands clutched in his, had looked more haggard than she had ever seen him. His cheeks and chin were coated with dark stubble. New creases lined his forehead and bracketed his mouth. His relief when she squeezed his hand and gave him a weak smile was heartbreaking. Climbing into bed, he spooned up behind her, buried his face in her hair, and hugged the stuffing out of her for at least half an hour. "You scared the hell out of me," he whispered brokenly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." His lips brushed the back of her neck. "I love you, Sarah." He pressed closer as though he would burrow beneath her skin. "If he could, I love you so much." Smiling, she closed her eyes as drowsiness slunk through her. "I love you." To Seth and David were in the kitchen preparing dinner when they sensed Darnell's approach. David paused in the midst of basting the organic Cornish hens. The knife Seth was applying to several carrots for a salad stopped slicing. Both felt their human friends, emotions fluctuating wildly, and exchanged a concerned glance before turning toward the entrance. When Darnell filled the doorway, he was carrying a sheaf of printed papers and looked shell-shocked. "What is it?" David asked, setting aside his spoon and wiping his hands on a nearby towel. Darnell's throat worked as he swallowed audibly. "I finally managed to decrypt the files on one of the laptops you stole when you rescued Ameriska." The mystery woman had finally disclosed her name. When she had awakened after sleeping for nearly 2 days, Seth abandoned the knife and carrots as Darnell approached them. "And they're all about Amy," he said, pronouncing the nickname he had given her as one would. Why? How long they held her, the tests and experiments they performed on her, horrible, torturous experiments. And there were so many of them. Seth cocked his head to one side. "Do they say who she is, where they found her?" She was powerful enough that Seth couldn't read her mind and glean the information himself without her knowing, and he didn't want to frighten her. Slowly Darnell nodded. "You aren't going to believe it." "Hell, I've read it 5 times, and I don't believe it." Seth took the papers he proffered and held them so David could read them till when Seth reached the first significant passage, shock filtered through him. "Are you serious?" David breathed beside him. Movement drew their gazes to the entrance. Mariska stood there watching them, eyes wide, her pretty face filling with trepidation as she realized they now knew her secret. Sarah smiled as Roland took her hand and twined his fingers through hers. Though there was only the barest sliver of a moon, she had no difficulty seeing, and gazed with wonder at the night scene around her. It was all so clear as clear as it would be on a cloudy afternoon, tall majestic trees that thickened into a forest, fireflies sparkling in their midst, a rolling meadow liberally sprinkled with low-growing wildflowers, many of which had closed their petals for the night. In the center of it all rested their new home, a spacious one-story with an equally spacious basement and 3 escape tunnels similar to David's. All had been completed in only a few weeks' time thanks to Chris and the network, while Sarah had adjusted to the changes taking place in her body as they strolled up the pretty cobblestone path that led from the driveway to the front porch. Sarah again marveled at the proliferation of scents that danced on the summer breeze. The most compelling, of course, was Roland's no cologne, just soap and water, and him yum. And the sounds before there had just been the chee-chee-chee of those weird bugs and the croaking of frogs. Now she heard the wind brushing her clothing, field mice scuttling through the distant grasses, and a possum lumbering through the forest a mile away, and the soft clop of deer hooves and the grinding of their teeth as they grazed near a stream. Beyond that, an owl's feathers beat the air overhead as it scouted for prey, but wings flapped. As the night creatures gorged themselves on insects, Roland's heartbeat, strong and steady, picked up a bit. When she smiled at him, her senses were so much sharper now, all of them, even touch. And her strength, she was even stronger and faster than Atlantean, and Lysette, a fact that astonished them all and titillated the hell out of the scientists. At the network, no one had expected that. Not even Seth. Younger immortals were always weaker than older immortals. Had being turned by an immortal instead of a vampire made the difference? Was there something unique in Roland's blood? Was it because he was so much older, his bloodline pure? No one knew. The network had been hounding Roland to bring Sarah to the lab ever since word had gotten out, but he had flatly refused. He was protecting her, she knew, and had no interest in submitting to their tests himself. It was important though, so Sarah decided she'd work on him later and see if she couldn't coax him into changing his mind. He may be a grumpy Gus with others, but with her he was a real softy. You really like it? He asked. I love it, she vowed. As they climbed the steps to the covered front porch, he paused and drew her into the circle of his embrace. And I love you. He dipped his head, captured her lips in a slow sensual kiss. Wife, and I love you. Till she whispered against his lips. Husband. A soft growl rumbled forth as he deepened the kiss, sliding his hands down to cup her bottom and clutch her to him. When she drew back, she knew her eyes were glowing green, could feel her fangs descending as they did whenever she was in the grip of strong emotion. Seeing herself like that for the first time had been quite a shock. She and Roland had just made love in the shower, and she had caught her reflection in the mirror as they emerged, stunned, speechless. She had gaped at her reflection. So long the fangs had receded, and her eyes had faded back to normal. Roland, seeing her disappointment, and always happy to be of service, had stepped up behind her and palmed her breasts, teasing her nipples to hardness and making her breath catch. Her eyes had almost instantly begun to glow again. Her fangs had descended. Astonishing. That was going to be even harder to get used to than drinking blood, which really wasn't that bad since she didn't actually drink it. She just bit down into the bag, and her fangs siphoned the liquid into her veins. Your eyes are glowing, he murmured, rubbing noses with her. So are yours. He smiled. They'll always glow when I want. You're releasing her. He unlocked the door and punched in the security code. Then turning, he lifted her into his arms, carried her across the threshold, and stopped short. Sarah followed his gaze and stared at their living room in disbelief. Wow. There were brightly wrapped gifts everywhere, on every surface, every piece of furniture stacked nearly as high as the ceiling. Roland lowered her feet to the floor and closed the door. Seth warned me there would be wedding presents, but I didn't expect there to be so many. The two of them had been married earlier that evening in David's backyard in a private ceremony attended by Seth, David, Marcus, Chris, Luzette, and ATN that was presided over by a minister friend of Chris as well. Private wasn't entirely accurate. The wedding had been broadcast live over the internet on a heavily encrypted website. Only other immortal guardians and their seconds could access. So many around the world had been awed and enchanted by their story that they had wanted to witness the historic event themselves. Sarah and Roland had consented. Are these all from Seth and David? She asked. Roland glanced at the cards and the packages closest to them. They're from everyone. Every immortal on the planet sent something by the looks of it. But they don't even know me, most don't know me either, and few that do like me. I'm as stunned as you are." They stood there for a long moment before he took her hand. "Why don't we put off opening these until later? There's something I want to show you." "Okay." Wending his way through the mountains of boxes, Roland led her to the back door. Sarah followed him out into the shadows that darkened the large deck, a pretty meadow spread out before them, and off to the side was, she gasped, a veggie garden. "I regretted that you never got to plant yours." Throwing her arms around his neck, she hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Roland, it's perfect." He grinned, locking his arms behind her back. "You're perfect." Bending, he kissed her forehead, her cheeks, then her lips. "Thank you for saving my life, Sarah, in so many ways." She kissed him back. "Thank you for transforming mine." This concludes Darkness Dawns. Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.